Good morning, and welcome to the fifth hearing of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission's 2026 annual report cycle. Thank you for joining us. We welcome our witnesses and are grateful they're here today to share their expertise. I'd also like to extend our appreciation to the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions for use of their hearing room, as well as the Senate Recording Studio for their assistance in live streaming this event. For those attending in person or watching online, witness testimonies are available on the Commission's website, and a transcript of this hearing will also be posted to the website. Today's hearing will examine China's motivations and strategies for acquiring data, both domestically and abroad, and how Beijing is working to integrate this vast collection into a unified, state-directed framework. Chinese leaders view data as a strategic asset, a driver of economic growth, indigenous innovation, and industrial policy, but also as a tool to shape and control global information flows in support of military and national security objectives. This approach reflects a deliberate, top-down effort to embed data dominance at the center of China's economic and geopolitical strategy. It also underscores Beijing's intent not just to compete in the digital economy, but to set the terms by which data is governed, accessed, and exploited globally. While Washington continues to debate and deliberate on this issue, Beijing has spent the better part of a decade building a comprehensive regulatory and operational architecture designed to do two things simultaneously: hoard its own data and systematically vacuum up ours. The asymmetry is stark. China's regulations, such as its cybersecurity law and data security law, are instruments of strategic data accumulation. Beijing identifies what constitutes important data and compels its companies to share such data with the state. China stockpiles software vulnerabilities reported within 48 hours of discovery and is under no obligation to disclose those vulnerabilities to foreign organizations, all to bolster its own offensive cyber capabilities. Meanwhile, Chinese scientists have legally accessed data from UK biobanks, reported as recently as last week, US genomic databases, and global data markets with relative ease, while China's similar data remain firmly off limits to foreign researchers and companies. Beijing also seeks to gain data advantage through state-sponsored cyber operations. China's Advanced Persistent Threat Groups, or APTs, have spent decades burrowing into US networks and critical infrastructure across the defense, healthcare, telecommunications, and energy sectors. The 2015 Office of Personnel Management breach alone exposed sensitive personal and security clearance data on 22.5 million Americans. And more recently, the APT known as Salt Typhoon has been conducting a years-long campaign against US government agencies. In just 1 year, from 2024 to 2025, cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike reported a 150% surge in espionage attacks and a 300% increase in targeted industrial cyber attacks. These are campaigns that are state-orchestrated, persistent, and increasingly AI-enabled. None of this is new. What is new is the scale, the sophistication, and the sobering reality that the vectors of threat are likely more comprehensive than anything we can fully imagine today. I look forward to the insights of our panelists today on both the scope of this challenge and the policy actions required to address it. Thank you to the panelists for being here today. We will start with Dr. Lohn. Oh, Susie. Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. Thank you, Commissioner Miller.
Coach.
Good to be here. Thank you to our witnesses for being here this morning and to our staff at the Commission for the preparation that's gone into this hearing. Data has become a foundational input to modern economies, enabling technological breakthroughs, driving innovation, and improving quality of life. The digital economy represents over 15% of global output, a figure that continues to grow. But data collected and used without appropriate safeguards is also a national security vulnerability. We've seen these risks materialize repeatedly through large-scale data breaches, the opaque practices of data brokers, and the collection of sensitive user data by foreign-owned apps. Over the past 2 decades, China has developed a comprehensive strategy to acquire, aggregate, and exploit data as a strategic resource. Individual data sets may appear low sensitivity in isolation, but when telecommunications metadata, geolocation data, financial transactions, biometric records, and travel histories are aggregated and processed with advanced AI capabilities, the result is something far more dangerous: the ability to identify, track, profile, and potentially coerce U.S. military personnel, intelligence officers, and policymakers. Some responsive steps have been taken. The Justice Department has moved to restrict bulk data transfers to foreign adversaries. The FTC issued warning letters to 13 data brokers earlier this year. These are meaningful signals that the legal tools exist and that enforcement agencies are beginning to act. But we are at present documenting this problem more effectively than we are solving it. As the United States and China compete across artificial intelligence, quantum, biotechnology, access to large-scale, high-quality data has and will continue to play a determining role in shaping which country will lead global technology development. The United States, alongside our allies, remains at the cutting edge of science and technology, but our lead grows more tenuous by the day. Now is the time for us to ensure that Congress and U.S. policymakers realize the scale of the challenge we face concerning China's data strategy, to forge a long-term approach to curb China's problematic activities and address our own vulnerabilities. Our witnesses today will help us better understand the rationale behind China's data acquisition strategy, how it is implemented, and its implications for the United States. By examining both the why and the how, we aim to identify actionable recommendations that Congress can use to more effectively address China's acquisition and misuse of U.S. data. I look forward to their testimony. Commissioner Miller.
And now we will turn to Dr. Lohn for his testimony.
I'd like to open by thanking the Commission for this opportunity. It's an honor to be invited to this forum to discuss such an important and rapidly evolving topic. I lead a small team of researchers at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where my team's focus is on the intersection of AI and cybersecurity. We also study what's required to create and deploy advanced AI systems in terms of finances, semiconductors, models, and other underpinnings of the technology. These are all intense areas of competition with China. This testimony will briefly discuss Chinese acquisition of American AI technology and how AI can enhance their cyber operations going forward, and I'll conclude with a few policy recommendations to limit those risks. China's cyber teams have been targeting American defense contractors, technology companies, government agencies, and citizens for decades, but their approach and our views have evolved over time. I remember optimism 10 years ago, such as following the Obama-Xi meeting, that China might agree not to use cyber espionage for commercial gain. Today, I hear less optimism about any ideological restraint, and it seems that the CCP views cyber as one tool among many for acquiring U.S. technology. They buy compiled data sets from data vendors, they use their positions in markets such as autonomous vehicles or commercial drones to enhance sensor coverage. They siphon off data in transit around the world as it passes through their telecommunications infrastructure, and they poach specialized knowledge of talented individuals, such as through the Thousand Talents and related programs. Now, the technology of the day is AI, and American companies developing it are often relative upstarts who have little experience as targets of sophisticated espionage campaigns, and whose business models often rely on providing access to their technology at extreme scales. Our AI companies are becoming even more enticing targets as their models and services become more capable, especially in the cyber domain. The company Expo topped the bug bounty leaderboard last year, finding more vulnerabilities than any human, and Anthropic's new Mythos has the cyber world buzzing. But China does not view AI technology exactly as we do. While US AI technology giants block their services from going to China, China also uses its Great Firewall to block those services on their side. And despite loosening export controls on US AI chips last year, China has not purchased any of those chips yet. Their reluctance is due to several factors. One is to support their domestic industry. Another is to avoid reliance on American models or services that could be restricted in a conflict, that could disseminate an American worldview, or that could even be poisoned to subvert Chinese interests. Now, contrasting that reluctance, China is also aggressively stealing all aspects of AI technology. Chinese companies are smuggling billions of dollars of US AI chips. The CCP is tempting or coercing AI researchers to China using both carrots, such as the Thousand Talents programs, and sticks, as in Operation Fox Hunt. And all three US AI leaders, Alphabet, OpenAI, and Anthropic, have accused China of using American outputs to train Chinese copies using techniques known as adversarial distillation. The various forms of theft, along with their own inventiveness, have kept Chinese companies near the American frontier. The American lead is often estimated at only around 6 or 7 months, so we should expect that the AI-induced cyber advances we see today in America will come to China soon. Already, we've seen Chinese attackers string together many separate AI models to conduct complex, if relatively unsophisticated, cyber attacks in ways that threaten to upend our strategy of layered defenses. At the same time, software maintainers are already being overwhelmed by the number of vulnerabilities that AI is discovering. It's not clear yet whether AI will help them close those gaps or if it will find too many holes for them to manage. We should also expect the impacts of theft to become even more damaging as AI enhances digitization. 20 years ago, there was far less to steal online. Now, with AI becoming people's therapists and as agentification forces companies to digitize their workflows, the severity of coercion and the risk of intellectual property theft will continue to grow. Defensively, setting aside the many technical steps to take and the role that industry must play, there's plenty for federal regulators to do. As a starting point, much of the burden of preventing theft falls on the Critical Infrastructure and Security Agency, CISA, which is understaffed from layoffs, has had leadership uncertainties, and has been plagued by intermittent shutdowns as part of the Department of Homeland Security. They're a focal point for security guidance, for informing industry of threats and vulnerabilities, and they are the sector management agency for information technology. Information sharing among AI companies and the intelligence community will also be crucial as the threats continue to grow and attackers attempt to hide themselves. Much of that falls on the National Security Agency's AI Security Center and the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. Staffing and funding CISA and those information sharing efforts is necessary to secure American AI software from theft. As for the hardware that's being smuggled, the Bureau of Industry and Security is responsible for preventing and interdicting those shipments, but they've historically been underfunded, so boosting their funding would help. Identifying smugglers remains difficult, though, so Congress can mandate location monitoring for restricted chips. Those techniques face many limitations, but the value of the chips is large and growing, so helping to find even a small fraction of illicit shipments could help make up for the cost and difficulties. Finally, and most broadly, the United States, and Congress in particular, should be cautious with the sacrifices it makes in pursuit of AI, given the alerts raised by American labs that China is freeloading off American investment. If America is to reallocate energy and water infrastructure, to finance or backstop corporations, or to provide regulatory relief for construction, privacy concerns, copyright infringement, or psychosocial harms, then the benefits should not accrue to China. Congress and the American taxpayer should demand assurances that AI developers can protect the technology as a precondition to receiving our support. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lohn. Mr. Lin.
Chairman Schreiber, Vice Chairman Kuiken, distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity today to testify. In my written testimony, I document how the PRC has undertaken a systematic state-directed effort to convert data into intelligence advantage, economic leverage, coercive influence, and wartime decision superiority. In the time that I have before you today, I want to focus on just one point. The United States is still treating this challenge far too defensively. We treat breaches, privacy, and critical infrastructure as separate issues. Beijing does not see it that way. The PRC treats data as a strategic resource. It treats commercial networks as intelligence collection platforms, civilian logistics systems as potential military targets, and persistent cyber access as a form of pre-conflict positioning. And that is the core problem. China is not merely stealing data. It is doing so to build an AI-enabled intelligence and targeting architecture for economic competition, political coercion, and wartime advantage. Over the last 5 years, the threat has changed in 3 key ways. First, China's cyber operations feed intelligence, military, and political objectives. That is not just traditional espionage or intellectual property theft. Campaigns associated with Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon show that the PRC is targeting the systems the United States would depend on in a crisis. Telecommunications providers, transportation networks, and civilian critical infrastructure, systems that support our military modernization. In other words, a future conflict over Taiwan would not begin only in the Taiwan Strait, it would begin at home. This is all part of China's plan to coerce, deter, and defeat the United States. Now, second, China has built an ecosystem that facilitates industrial-scale cyber operations. Let me repeat that again. Industrial scale cyber operations. The relevant actor is not only the PLA or the MSS, it is also a wider ecosystem of contractors, hacker-for-hire firms, access brokers, and even commercial technology companies. This ecosystem gives Beijing reach, deniability, and surge capacity, letting Chinese state organs acquire access and data at a scale government operators alone could not generate. Third, AI raises the strategic value of everything that China is collecting. Data that might once have sat unused in a repository can now be fused, searched, modeled, and operationalized. Telecommunications metadata can reveal networks of associations, location data, movement patterns. Health, financial, and family data can reveal personal vulnerabilities. Logistics, maintenance, and supplier data can reveal mobilization bottlenecks, weaknesses in weapon systems, and weaknesses in the defense industrial base. The result is a fusion problem that we have. Bulk commercial data, persistent cyber access, and AI are converging faster than US policy is adapting. That convergence is equally dangerous for US military and national security personnel. The Defense Intelligence Agency has warned about ubiquitous technical surveillance, which is the aggregation of data that links people to devices, locations, transactions, relationships, and patterns of life. And this is not just a theoretical problem that we have. Public reporting on Israeli operations against Iranian military and political leaders illustrates what can happen when systematic intelligence collection, cyber penetration, and data analytics are fused effectively. Senior officials can be tracked, located, targeted with a precision that would have been much harder to achieve in an earlier era. The implication is clear. Commercial data is now operational data. Civilian networks are now military-relevant terrain, and privacy exposure is a force protection risk. While we've taken important steps, including DOJ's data security program and public actions against Chinese cyber actors and infrastructure, it is not enough. The overall US response remains too focused on defense, compliance, and resilience. Those things are necessary, but they are not sufficient. If the expected return on Chinese cyber operations remains high and the expected costs remain manageable, Beijing will continue. That is deterrence 101. China will not stop because we issue advisories, patch faster, or even write better compliance rules. We have to change the cost calculus. So I would emphasize 3 recommendations. Number 1, Congress should support sustained offensive pressure against Chinese cyber operators and the infrastructure that enables them. The objective should not be episodic retaliation after major incidents. It should be continuous campaigning against adversary infrastructure, access brokers, and contractor-operated intrusion platforms. We must force Chinese operators to spend more time building access, more money defending their infrastructure, and more effort protecting their tradecraft. Right now, China has been able to impose persistent costs on us while bearing too little reciprocal burden. 2, the US should target the ecosystem, not just the government operators. Chinese cyber power is scalable because contractors, data brokers, technology vendors, and other commercial actors provide access, deniability, and surge capacity. The United States should use sanctions, criminal charges, export control, and public exposure to make participation in that ecosystem commercially dangerous and strategically costly. The message should be simple. If a company helps the MSS or PLA cyber operators target the United States and its allies, it should lose access to US capital, US technology, and US markets. 3, Congress should treat strategically relevant data as national security infrastructure. And that means codifying a national security data control regime, creating telecommunications and core network security requirements, and passing secure by design requirements for edge devices and networking gear. And it means protecting military-adjacent commercial data. Now, I am not suggesting that we copy China's model of state data control, but we have to recognize that openness without guardrails is being converted into adversary leverage. China's data acquisition strategy is not just about stealing secrets. It is about building decision advantage. It is about mapping the people, networks, infrastructure, and dependencies behind US power projection. It is about accelerating Chinese AI and military modernization, and ultimately, it is about creating options to delay, disrupt, or deter US action in a crisis. Defense alone will not restore deterrence. We need to put China's cyber ecosystem under pressure, force Beijing to spend more defending its own networks, and deny it the ability to convert American openness into strategic leverage. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lin. Mr. Cory.
Good morning, Chairman, Vice Chair, Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here this morning. My core point today is simple. China has spent over a decade building a coordinated state industry response to what it sees as the foundational input of the digital and AI economy, data. The United States has not made an equivalent adjustment. The United States still has the world's most innovative firms, but they are competing in a global market shaped by a competitor that treats technology policy as a coordinated national project, while the United States treats it as a portfolio of separate regulatory and trade questions. Data governance runs on parallel tracks at Commerce, State, Treasury, the FTC, Justice and others, each handling a slice, none really responsible for the whole. We have many of the pieces, but we do not really have a data policy layer in the US tech policy stack. The gap in action between the two matters because of where we are in the global digital and AI market and the competition for market share at the moment. The competitive architecture of the next decade is being set now in procurement rules, national AI and data laws, and standards bodies. China treats data as a factor of production on equal footing with land, labour, capital and technology. President Xi has said this repeatedly since 2021, and Beijing has since built the legal, regulatory and institutional machinery to act on it. The Data 20 article sets the economic framework, the National Data Bureau, established in 2023, is operationalising it, and the World Data Organization, launched only last month in Beijing, may well become the platform to try and export it. You can see this same pattern apply in specific sectors, such as physical AI. China has built more than 40 state-funded robot data collection centres nationwide and has issued a unified data collection standard to ensure every robot generates training data in interoperable formats. Leading firms are releasing open data sets under state pressure to build shared industry infrastructure rather than proprietary moats. And you can see it in standards, with the role of China's TC 260 translating Cyberspace Administration of China policy into technical standards in these specific sectors, and then aiming to take those same standards to international standards bodies. Now compare this to the United States. We withdrew from the WTO digital trade negotiations in 2023, ceding the field to both Beijing and Brussels. The Trump administration has partly corrected this, but not broadly or consistently enough. We have no national equivalent robotics data infrastructure initiative, by example, and national security-driven actions targeting data are similarly haphazard, fragmented, and often delayed. The US thankfully continues to stand behind the global cross-border privacy rules system, and likewise the Trump administration has launched the Genesis mission to put federal scientific data sets to work training AI models, and is obviously pushing ahead through the AI Action Plan and AI Exports Program. And in Congress, there's bipartisan legislative proposals that are worth considering, such as the Digital Trade Promotion Act and the National Commission on Robotics Act. But there is still no data policy layer in the US tech policy stack. We have the firms, we have some of the policies, we have some of the ideas, but we do not have the strategy that pulls it together. This brings me to Southeast Asia and the compounding effect of early entry and data collection, the flywheel. In digital markets, more users generate more data, which trains better products, which attract more users, which generates more data. Once a platform reaches critical mass in a market, displacing it becomes very difficult. In digital markets, early wins compound. And in right now, the flywheel either spins for you or against you, and in Southeast Asia, it is increasingly spinning up for China. Chinese platforms hold roughly half of e-commerce gross merchandise value across several major markets. Chinese firms are laying the undersea cables and building data centres that move the region's data. Chinese cloud providers are increasingly aggressive and successful in winning contracts at prices that reflect state subsidy, not commercial cost recovery. And under China's data security law and national intelligence law, that data is legally accessible to the Chinese state, with no independent judiciary to constrain access and no transparency requirement that would allow anyone outside Beijing to know when access occurs. This is a structural difference. US firms operate under rule of law. Chinese firms operate under the rule of potential compulsion. Both compete in Southeast Asia, which is a critical market for US and Chinese firms. Only one carries a home country governance regime that turns commercial data into state accessible data and an input into its national project. The difference is that the US private sector is competing abroad largely without a coherent government strategy and toolkit behind it. Let me close with three categories of recommendations. First, Codify US digital trade priorities. Congress should pass the Digital Trade Promotion Act to codify protections for cross-border data flows and other critical pro-digital trade provisions so they survive administration turnover, and re-engage WTO digital trade negotiations with a clear and strong position. Second, make Southeast Asia a priority theatre. Back the US ASEAN Digital Work Plan with real funding and staff at state and the Development Finance Corporation, and explicitly prioritise it under the American AI Export Program. The administration should continue to push the global cross-border privacy rules expansion. Bringing Vietnam, Indonesia and India would change the balance of data governance in the Asia-Pacific. And that should also try to operationalise the OECD Trusted Government Access to Data principles, so partner countries have the legal tools to distinguish trusted from untrusted providers on grounds beyond price, which is what obviously Chinese providers excel on. Third, emulate some of the institutions China has built that we obviously haven't, such as a national industrial robotics data foundry to give US manufacturers, especially SMEs, the shared training data infrastructure that China is building at scale. The administration should push for a trusted cloud initiative with Five Eyes partners, Japan, the EU and others, to give allied governments and commercial buyers a common framework for distinguishing trustworthy and untrustworthy cloud providers. Finally, they should institutionalise the analytical framework that Commerce used in the connected vehicles rulemaking so that we can identify genuine data-related choke points across critical technologies systemically and proportionately rather than reactively. And with that, I thank you again for the opportunity to testify this morning, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cory, and thank you all for all your testimonies. We will do questions in alphabetical order, but I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to kick us off. Mr. Lin, you highlight in your testimony that biotechnology and health data deserve special attention as Beijing deems this a strategic resource, not just a purely privacy issue, the way it's often viewed in the U.S. Can you dive into that issue a little bit more and tie it into why we should care about China's ability to access things like the UK biobanks, our American genomics databases, and other key health and bio databases in the West? And by the way, anyone else who would like to contribute to this after Mr. Lin is welcome.
Thank you, sir. I think it's important to note the sheer scale of what China is trying to accomplish in the genomic space, especially through institutions like the Beijing Genomics Institute. It's important to not just focus, I think, just on the genomics or even the health data part, but to look at that as simply one slice of an overall data aggregation, processing, and computing strategy, where what they want to be able to do is they want to obviously be able to leverage this for medical and health benefits for research, but also undoubtedly they are doing so in order to be able to do genetic level targeting. Ultimately, that is the objective. And so when we think about that, we have to think both in terms of what is China doing, what sorts of data are they making accessible, what other types of data are they trying to collect from a personal health records perspective, not just within China, but outside of it. Presumably this is so that their database has an increased amount of diversity as well. And so thinking through what are the types of protections that we have to put in place, and also that certainly applies to our own policies within the United States. How do we govern things like genomics information? How do we ensure that only the right researchers, only the right hospitals, providers have access? And how do we make sure we have the right protections in place?
I think biodata is a particularly interesting case. It's obviously been sensitive and important in China for decades, going back to 1998. And it's one where they've institutionalized domestic controls around it the earliest, in that there are rules that require genomic data to only be stored in China, to only be accessed by authorized personnel. And so they've set up the mechanism to control it, to aggregate it, and then they're now operationalizing it as a part of their industrial policy.
This is not my expertise, but anticipating this question discussed with a colleague, Dr. Steph Batalis, yesterday, and her answer struck me, so I'll try to pass it here. She explains pretty clearly or convincingly that targeted bioweapons is not a real risk here, but that de-identification is. We have lots of people who want to be not identified as they're walking around special operations forces or military who don't want to have their identity in those locations tracked back. And if even their family members or distant relatives have been collected with their DNA, then they can be identified and then coerced in other ways.
Thank you. Let's move back to Mr. Cory. One of your recs was for Congress and the administration to establish a national industrial robotics foundry. Can you explain that concept in a little more depth for us?
Basically, the data required to train physical AI is different from large language models. And so they can't obviously just access it publicly off the internet. And so it comes through the repetitious creation or monitoring of robots set up doing particular functions and capturing that. And so that obviously happens in individual silos in firms across America. And that lack of sharing is exactly what China's addressed by creating and forcing everyone to use the standard format. So with the use of certain robots in certain scenarios can be equally applied to another firm elsewhere. And so similarly, getting NIST and working with industry on what that equivalent standard would look like here, and then setting up pilot projects for that within existing sort of arm institutes would be essentially a way for the US to respond and start that same aggregation of common data to allow US robotics firms to benefit from what everyone else is doing, essentially.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with you, Mr. Cory. In your testimony, you gave us a fantastic overview of China's data supervision and governance landscape, explaining how certain agencies oversee regulatory aspects, some data governance aspects, some are offensive, some are defensive. So big picture, how would you characterize the structure of China's entire state-driven data framework? And is there any similarity here with how the U.S. does or does not structure its various data-related government entities?
Big picture. I think it's hard to find any comparator to what China has created institutionally in the role and the power of the CAC, the Cyberspace Administration of China, which is a regulatory and party body. And you cannot distinguish in what it does, what is a regulatory decision and what is a political decision. And it has created an apparatus and a mechanism around data on the domestic aggregation and sharing of it and the activation of its value, which it does through standards and sectoral bodies, but then obviously enacting, on the other side, strict controls on who can access that data and where that data can go. And so, I mean, as is always the case with China, they've created a central institution that acts in a way in a central coordinating function that there is no equivalent, I don't think, anywhere else in the world. And I think it's particularly interesting, the new National Data Bureau is under the National Development and Reform Commission. And that's important because that gives it an industrial policy lens as it looks at what it does. Like, don't confuse the National Data Bureau with some data protection authority. Its lens is on how do we activate the value of data in China in a centralised, coordinated manner, obviously involving all the relevant sectoral regulatory authorities and such.
Thank you, Mr. Cory. We'll move next to my esteemed co-chair, Commissioner Slevin.
Thank you, Commissioner Miller. Thanks for each of your testimonies. I think you each illustrated well the scale and ambition, speed with which China's cyber operations have been targeted against the U.S. and allies over the last few years, and that you've each hinted in your own way and suggested the congressional response has been muted compared to the scale. I want to ask, and also maybe a little bit of a big picture question around just China's risk tolerance and how that you've seen that change. Previous intrusions, attacks showed some effort of concealment in a way. That seems like that has evolved. And so maybe beginning with Mr. Cory, I think your just sort of assessment of just the risk tolerance changing, and with that, is it changing methods? Is it changing the types of targets? Civilian versus military, but invite you to begin and then your colleagues to also.
I think I'll begin and focus on the commercial side of things, and then my co-panelists can look at the intelligence and defense aspect. But basically, China is creating an apparatus that obviously seeks to maximize the domestic accumulation and use of data in alignment with its strategic industrial policies. but akin, there's a central tension in as it does that, in that it wants to strictly control where that data is and who uses it, in that it is, I think as you mentioned at the top, the line of control the outflow, expand the inflow, as well as obviously maximising everything they generate domestically. The central part of my testimony vis-a-vis the Chinese legal apparatus providing broad, opaque state access to commercial data is at the heart of what could potentially come that my co-panelists have spoken about, in that there is no meaningful constraints on Chinese government's ability to access data and use it in any way, shape or form, whether that be for a commercial, industrial policy goal or intelligence or defence purpose. And that's baked in foundationally to the operating environment that these Chinese firms are in, whether they're operating at home or abroad. It's just that the question of the role of that opaque power has changed with the rise of AI and the increasing value of data. I mean, in final, it gives them broad authority to act however they want, whenever they want, and that's quite arbitrary. And I mean, I'm sure the Commission has heard the stories over the years, there's action and reaction as the US targets one thing with export controls or the Clean Network Initiative or whatever it may be, and then China will take a corresponding action. So they retain freedom of movement as it relates to controlling data whenever they want, essentially.
Thank you. Mr. Lin.
Yeah, Commissioner Sullivan, let me start with answering the first part of your question, which is, have we seen any change to how the PRC has looked at risk in terms of their cyber operations? And I think unequivocally the answer is yes. What we see is that China has become increasingly emboldened over the years, and unfortunately, we have ourselves to blame for that. So if you go back with me to your Thomas Schelling 101, and you look at things like signaling, you look at concepts like retaliating, and what we've done effectively is by not responding in any meaningful way, we have encouraged China to go up the escalatory ladder, right? What has our signal been? What have the consequences been to their increasingly egregious compromises of American networks? We started by saying, by justifying, rationalizing that, well, this is just state-on-state espionage, this is classic intelligence, we do it too, so there's really no difference, right? And so what have we done? We have, indicted a handful of PLA officers who probably have no intention ever of coming to the United States. We filed some démarches, and that's kind of it. And so the message to the PRC is, have at it, right? There are no consequences to your actions. And so ironically, even though we view offensive cyber operations as potentially escalatory, this has always been a concern of ours for a very long time. We can have a separate conversation about how it's actually not. Our lack of response, our focus only on defending our networks, our obsession with resilience has actually been highly escalatory and is encouraging them to now embed themselves into critical infrastructure in the United States, critical infrastructure networks, to start targeting middle America towns, water treatment facilities in Western Massachusetts. These are the types of things that they're doing now, and they think that there's no consequence to it.
Thank you, Mr. Lin. Dr. Lohn, anything you'd like to add?
Just quickly, I think that that's mostly true, but there have been some red lines. I don't know that they are ready to turn off power or mess with a water grid, because our response would go outside of the cyber domain and maybe outside of the policy domain. And I think that's maybe where the red line hits. And I'll provide you your time back.
Thanks. Commissioner Miller?
Thank you. Commissioner Brands is up next. He'll be joining us virtually.
Thank you. Maybe I could start with Mr. Lin, and I'd like to pick up kind of where that last discussion left off. And so you laid out an array of measures the U.S. could take to be more effective in terms of sustaining offensive pressure against Chinese cyber operators. What would you say the obstacles to doing this thus far have been? Is it risk aversion? Is it authorities issues, concerns about escalation, all of the above? You mentioned in particular that you thought that the last issue, concerns about escalation, is overblown. So I'd just be curious to hear you talk a little bit more about what has stood in the way so far.
It's always a little daunting to be discussing deterrence theory with the Henry Kissinger professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. but I'll try to hold my own. So, when it comes, what have been the impediments? I think certainly a misguided perception about escalation and how escalatory cyber can be. For a very long time, if you think about the origins of offensive cyber, how we governed it, how we organized it, how we tried to control it, we put the predecessor to what is now U.S. Cyber Command, and actually initially U.S. Cyber Command, under the umbrella of U.S. Strategic Command. For a long time, it was believed that cyber weapons were potentially as dangerous, as escalatory, as uncontrollable as nuclear weapons, and so we had to be extraordinarily cautious. That's what defined our thinking early on. And I think the very best evidence of how non-escalatory offensive cyber operations and cyber attacks is by our lack of response to all of the attacks that China has been throwing our way. What have we actually done? Not much, right? So that's part one. Number two, your question around policies, your question around authorities. The authorities are there. I think there's a question historically around willingness, but I think starting with the first Trump administration's approach towards delegating decision authority to U.S. Cyber Command through NSPM 13, that's been a very welcome push in that direction to make it easier to lower the barriers to using offensive cyber capabilities. And I think what you're seeing now with the second Trump administration as well is a willingness, a far greater willingness to use non-kinetic and especially cyber capabilities as part of joint military operations. So I think that willingness is now there. In terms of authorities, the authorities are there. We have the authorities, whether we're talking about Title 10, 50, 18, we have them. It's just a matter of, are we willing to actually use them, to put them to use? And then number three, one of the things that you didn't mention, but I would hammer on is, have we approached this problem of force generation from the right perspective, right? Because ultimately that's part of what we're talking about is this is a force generation problem. And do we have the right capabilities in place? Do we have the right people in place? Do we have the right models in place where we are also able to conduct industrial scale cyber operations? For a very long time, we have approached offensive cyber operations through an artisanal lens, and we have to change that. We can no longer rely on just a handful of extraordinarily talented, committed cyber operators to be the tip of the spear. We have to figure out how do we mobilize the entire force and ensure that they're equipped with the right capabilities to do so, rather than simply continue to try to throw more people at the problem.
Thank you. And while I have you, you referenced the ability to use data to target senior officials. And so maybe you could just expand a bit on what we've learned about this from recent military engagements. And perhaps you could just kind of paint us a little bit of a picture of what this might look like if China were to try to do something similar to the United States in a crisis or conflict scenario.
Yeah, sure. So let me talk about this both in the abstract and then, to go back into the example of at least reportedly what the Israelis have been able to do against Iranian political and military targets. The sheer amount of data that every single one of us generates, even right now in this very moment, is extraordinary. The amount of data that is being generated by our phones, which are attached to us, by our smart devices that we're wearing. All of this can be used to track pattern of life. All of this can be used to track our movements, our biodata, right? And so you can imagine that if a foreign adversary wanted to use this data to coerce individuals, to track individuals, to gain leverage over them, or in the case of at least reportedly what's happened in Iran, with what the Israelis have been able to carry out, they've been able to do highly targeted precision strikes simultaneously against entire layers of Iranian military and intelligence leadership. This is something that, going back 200 years, our military thinkers probably would have thought, or even 100 years, would have thought impossible, but this is extraordinary. And so I think we're in a brave new world. And for ourselves, what this means is twofold. One, we have to get much better at protecting that data, certainly, but we also have to think about how do we use that to our advantage as well.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Hodges.
Thank you. Picking up on the conversation that just took place with Commissioner Brands, I just want to kind of clarify a little bit here on the issue of what we've seen publicly available and sort of the increasing capabilities and sort of access into data into the United States, would you agree that we're seeing the Chinese sort of expanding their domains? And can you speak a little bit more to sort of how they may be pre-positioning here inside the United States that's of concern to us? Mr. Lin, and this ties back into sort of the sort of deterrence theory and question that you were just having, conversation you were just having. But I guess I'm curious, just to help us understand and help the public understand, like, how is that pre-positioning actually taking root, and not just potential like for threats, but where specifically are we seeing them pre-position in ways they previously hadn't? Yes.
Sure. Yeah, happy to lead off. To abstract up a little bit, the best way to think about the pre-positioning that the PRC is doing now in the cyber domain is, during the Cold War, what we called counter-value targeting, right? For a very long time, we approached it, we viewed what China was doing to us from the lens of purely intelligence collection, IP theft, things like that. And then that started to broaden out where they would target our government and military networks, but we said, of course, that's what they would do, right? But now they're going after broad swaths of American society. I mentioned earlier in my remarks that they're going after things like water treatment plants in rural Massachusetts that have zero military or political value, right? So ultimately, why are they doing that? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. It's to be able to hold American society at risk so that in time of war, they can start to turn up the pain. How much pain are we willing to tolerate at home? How much are we willing to risk? This goes back to the old question of, are we willing to trade Los Angeles for Paris? Are we willing to trade, rural America, water treatment facilities for, coming to the aid of Taiwan or some other East Asian ally? And I think they believe that this is a way in which you can undermine political support for otherwise, popular national security decisions that the United States would make.
Perfect. Thank you. And so just to expand it out a little bit to the rest of the panelists, if I'm sort of combining what each of you has said, you've sort of framed this as a comprehensive, systematic approach across multiple domains with far-reaching consequences to national security here within the United States, as well as to nations overseas. And I guess one of the questions I'm constantly sort of grappling with and hearing as I sort of make the rounds with folks is, how much of this is nation to nation versus business to nation? And so recognizing we're here to sort of talk about U.S. and what we can do to sort of pre-position or stop against sort of the pre-positioning here, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on how much of this should be driven sort of from a business side versus a nation side. Mr. Cory, if you don't mind leading off.
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, because when you're facing Chinese firms, you're not just facing them alone. Chinese tech firms operate in an ecosystem and a market where they're able to essentially partially socialize the development costs of what they've had to go through to come to market overseas through preferential financing, discriminatory procurement, compute support, AI and data and power support, and then obviously external market support through the Digital Silk Road and others. And so when US firms who are competing on the basis of commercial operations and price and such, and they need to recoup their costs, their considerable costs by how they operate, I mean, they're facing an entity that is not playing on the same field in that, I mean, I know for a fact that like there are US cloud operators in Southeast Asia facing Chinese competitors that are providing free onboarding for new clients and are providing 60 to 80% price discounts up front. And that's just not commercially viable. And that reflects the state-supported nature of these Chinese cloud firms overseas. And so it's a different dynamic in terms of their relationship with their home government and what that means when they compete abroad.
Yeah, I would say that I agree with all of that. And the Chinese theft to support their companies is an industrial espionage that we would draw a different line on. They support their companies in all sorts of ways like that. I would also say that our companies, we might not be defending as well as we could be in lots of cases. There are several cases where their technology is being siphoned off, and we need to help identify in which ways and where the defenses are. Some of the distillation attacks that are happening right now are difficult to detect at the company level. Kyle Miller, who's here, walked me through some of that yesterday, and that the bottleneck where we might be able to have the most focus, leaning on what Joseph Lin is suggesting, is more upstream in a defense forward standpoint.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Kuiken.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Miller. You snuck up on me. It's been great hearing all of your testimony. Thank you very much. I have this sort of moment where you all triggered me a little bit this morning. Congress is debating the 702 renewal right now, which I'm sure most folks in the room are tracking. I used to work on these issues when I worked for Leader Schumer, and it was always amazing to me how spun up folks got about 702. And one of the reasons that I always got sort of reacted in sort of an odd way was that if anyone ever has downloaded their Amazon data or their LinkedIn data or their Twitter data or whatever data associated with any of the accounts, it is absolutely incredible the amount of data that is available on Nigel, on Joseph, and on Andrew, not let alone me and my beloved chair Randy Shriver. People always get fired up about Palantir and license plates. And I understand why, and at the same time you're driving down the road and it's publicly available, and Palantir basically took information that was already in the public space and just put it in one spot, which is essentially what Amazon's doing, LinkedIn's doing, and all these other folks are doing. I wrote an op-ed a few months ago in the Financial Times saying that data should be an asset that people are able to put on their balance sheet. They're doing this in China right now. And the reason that they're doing it is basically to get their way out of the debt crisis that they're in. And so if I have my assets on one side of the balance sheet, my liabilities on the other side, and it looks really bad, I'm in the red. And all of a sudden, all the data that I have, I can put on the asset side of the balance sheet. Things change quite a bit. The thing that people always talk about is the frontier labs and all the cool stuff that they're doing. The really cool stuff is what the companies that are at the infrastructure layer of the AI ecosystem are really doing. How do we start tapping into all of the data that we actually have? And one of the things that I realized is that the United States has absolutely no data strategy whatsoever from a US government perspective. I mean, we got data lakes, data ponds, data rivers, whatever sort of body of water. We probably have a data ocean in reality. As I'm listening to you guys sort of talk about the way the Chinese are approaching data, I sort of want to look inward, right? One of the things that we do at the end of the year is make recommendations to Congress on what the United States should do to sort of address this issue. You guys have said a lot of things, but the thing you haven't sort of said is, should the United States government think about getting its own data house in order? We can talk about no data to Europe, no data to China, no data to all these places. Well, until we sort of figure out what our strategy is or what we're actually going to do with the data, it seems we have some work to do. Welcome reactions to that. There's not really a question embedded in it other than a whole bunch of things to hopefully get you a little bit fired up. Andrew, you first.
Thank you for selecting me first.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I'm fired up about it also. You might have noticed in my testimony, in the written testimony, memory palaces. These things scare me, where people are recording all of their interactions. It's not a lake. They have it segmented off by rooms, but everything that they've written with an AI system is recorded to be used further. And the types of things that people are putting in these are different, more personal, more important to their operations, their businesses, and their daily lives than what we've recorded in the past. We've recorded so much in the past that I'm not sure how much more impactful it is, but I'm fired up about it as well.
All right, that's one. You're exactly on point, and it raises a critical point and theme in my testimony in that there are elements of what China is doing that the US should emulate in terms of the US government identifying priority sectors where there's a coordination challenge or a conflicting challenge that prevents their industry from coming together to figure out how do we develop the standards and the platforms and the pilots and the supportive infrastructure that allows us together collectively to do better. And because that's essentially what China has done in many regards, and they have the power of compulsion. They can force their industry to organize and open their data sets and open their models, not for commercial reasons, but for strategic reasons. And so that's why, again, in my testimony, focusing on robotics data infrastructure, it's just such a clear example where there is this, US industry suffers from this coordination challenge,
And the US has this amazing organization, NIST, that has a proven track record of working with industry to develop the standards and mechanisms that allows the industry to get on the same page as it relates to data and data sharing that supports them all. And so it's about emulating elements of it where there are obviously not market failures or coordination failures in the US industries in these critical sectors, and then with the right institutions setting about the process of getting everyone at the table and figuring out, okay, this is a shared challenge, how do we get at this together, which NIST has done repeatedly in the past.
I think my co-panelist said it well. Nothing more to add.
Okay, then I've got a second round before Commissioner Miller comes after me for going over. The Commission recently put out a report on China's open source ecosystem, sort of two pieces to it that we emphasized. One, China is doing a fairly effective job of deploying open source models. I think the assessment that at least I personally came to was that China needed to leverage the open source community basically to catch up and to slingshot their way either closer or, sort of side by side. The second thing we talked about is data and all of the data that just comes out of their deployment, effective deployment of these open source models and sort of the robotics environment that you just talked about, Mr. Cory. One of the criticisms that I got, the love letters that you get after the Commission puts these things out, is that we were a victim of the Chinese propaganda machine, and they're actually not doing this well. And how dare the Commission, go down this road and fall victim to it. I've tried to wire brush this assessment, and I'd love for you guys to tell us the Commission is dead wrong, and I don't really want to put you in that place, but what's your assessment of where China is in the open source ecosystem and the data that they get out of the deployment of their models, and then the sort of what we talk about is the two loops in the reinforcement cycle that this starts about that Mr. Cory just talked about. Just give me your assessment on where the Chinese are in their open source ecosystem, what's your read on it, and then just go back to the data piece as well and that embodied AI part.
Happy to lead off. I think you're exactly right, and the Commission's prior reports have been exactly on point and right. And again, referring to robotics as a great example of that, because it combines the power of Chinese ability to subsidize deployment with creating an industrial data infrastructure layer. Because with every robot deployed, you then thereby generate another lot of data. And by then imposing an open model system on that and then accompanying that with a unified data sharing template or standard, you create a whole different industry ecosystem. And so, China already leads the world in robots deployment, and they have coerced them to use a single standard, and they're forcing them to use an open model. Like, it's industrial scale data generation in a strategic technology. So I think robots, the case is really clear in that the Commission's prior work is exactly on point.
So the first thing I'd point out is, well, first of all, I love the report. So, don't ignore the haters.
Thanks, you.
But number two, China has adopted a deliberately open source approach when it comes to building artificial intelligence models. And I think there's the debate that we're often having around model performance, I think is a little bit of a red herring here, because that's ultimately not the discussion that we should be having. The discussion we should be having is around the speed and pace of AI adoption across Chinese society, across Chinese research institutions, and what we see there is that this open source approach actually makes AI adoption far easier. It lowers the barriers. And also, let's just not make any mistake about it. If you want to talk model performance, unfortunately, open source Chinese models outperform open source models everywhere else. They're very, very good. And you see a far warmer embrace of artificial intelligence in general across Chinese society. There have been reports of frontier labs setting up tables outside of supermarkets to sign people up for AI accounts. Again, right? So what you see is wholesale embrace and adoption of artificial intelligence. And what that means is you have a society, therefore, that is going to be transforming and adapting far faster than we are.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree that the Chinese models are at the top of the line. I know that some major U.S. companies use Chinese open models in their systems. The reason they do that is to protect their data, though, because if they don't want to ship that data off to Alphabet or OpenAI or Meta, and having an open model allows you to do that. But when I was in the White House a couple years ago, when we were going around trying to convince the world to tear out Chinese telecommunications infrastructure, it was because we could offer this model, they could offer that model, and so their prominence in open source models allows them to distribute their infrastructure that they can siphon data off with. So I think it's not the models directly, but the influence they get around the world as a result of those models that allows them to support their data acquisition.
Thank you, Mr. Lohn, and thank you, Commissioner Miller, for your forbearance.
Commissioner Price.
Thank you, and thank you all for your really excellent testimony today. I keep flipping back and forth through my notes and on what you've all said and what you've submitted to us on different questions, and it keeps coming back to the role of government and where we should be on that. So, and several of your policy recommendations, I feel like tinker with it, but there's no bigger, broader discussion. So I was hoping each of you could comment on that. Maybe start with any of, okay, Mr. Cory.
Big picture question or request. I mean, as in my opening remarks, the US is doing elements of what it needs to do across various agencies, but it lacks the central coherence and coordination. And so I think what that inevitably leads to as a starting point is situating it in the White House with OSTP and NSC and NEC in designating data policy, or however you want to phrase it, as a national priority, and then obviously bringing the respective agencies together under a clear vision, clear strategy, and a clear breakdown of who is doing what and where and how, and then obviously doing that in concert with Congress across sectoral priorities, national strategic, national security and critical infrastructure priorities. Because I mean, as a former government official, it may be a bit of a bland recommendation, but it starts with the institution and the agency arrangements to enable a more effective response. Because at the moment, it's very ad hoc, it's often reactive, and the sum is not more than the whole of the pieces. And so the US needs to get its act together from an institutional perspective, and then the tasking perspective, and then obviously working with Congress on like, well, what are our marching orders on post-quantum, on AI robotics, on whatever issue it is. There's a central coordination challenge problem there lacking, in my view.
Thank you. Mr. Lin?
I'm not a political economist, so I don't have especially strong opinions around things like wholesale industrial policy. But I will say this, which is, it's important, obviously, to recognize the challenge and the threats that the Chinese system presents to the United States and to its allies. But we have advantages as well that come from our free and open system. We have certain competitive advantages. Let's make sure we don't give those up. My focus, what I would talk about, is on the national security side, on the military and on the intelligence side, where the role of government is front and center. And so what I would say is we should have a strategy and objective of campaigning in the cyber domain and getting to a place where we're not just capable of carrying off one-off operations, but we're able to approach the problem from a perspective of multiple continuous operations on our end that feed off of each other. And so the question then becomes, what are the types of capabilities and resources that institutions, organizations like US Cyber Command, NSA, CIA, FBI, and even DHS need to have in order to get to a place, to a posture where we are able to campaign against our adversaries and put them on the back foot. That will require a whole of government effort. Let's not make any mistake about it. And hopefully that's something that we can get to within the near future.
Go ahead.
I tend to look at this as a whole bunch of different issues. Like the bio data is being scooped up. There's implantation in the critical infrastructure. There's siphoning off data from the telecommunications infrastructure worldwide. There's the distillation attacks. There's the smuggling of chips. And I think that, as you're pointing out, that me looking at them as each of these individual pieces is a problem. We suffer from a death by 1,000 paper cuts or a boiling frog situation. And so I think if we're looking big picture, we have to decide at what point would the aggregation of these be a red line of its own, and can we communicate those? We can't. We need to collectively think what is the set of data that, if acquired, would be a problem for us, and how can we communicate that set should not be taken. Within AI, that might be easier. It's a central focus of a technology, and it's got a handful of different aspects to it, but you might be able to say, you cannot have all of these things, or we will. Now, we'd have to be ready to act on our we wills, and I'm not sure exactly how strongly we want to do that. But
And on the AI side, aren't we relying on companies to police themselves?
Yes, we have been. I think that we should move away from that. California and New York have both tried to step away. SB 53 has some thou shalts for cybers, and the RAISE Act also does. I think that when I was in the White House, we tried a little bit to push in a couple of different directions to make companies that had highly capable AI systems meet some cyber standards, but it was maybe a little bit early. And now, as we're seeing these companies develop capabilities that are really practical, that are finding vulnerabilities in software, and that have really clear military, dual use, or economic applications, it might be time for us to step up and put in some, you must meet these cyber standards if you have models that are this expensive, or if you have this much revenue.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Over to Chair Shriver.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And let me also extend my thanks to the witnesses. Really fantastic testimony, and appreciate your comments thus far. I'm learning a lot. I could take this in a lot of different directions just based on things I'm hearing and learning, but I think I'll use the time to drill down a little more on something that's already been raised, I think primarily by Commissioner Brands and Commissioner Hodges, and that's, Mr. Lin, your presentation depicting China as pre-conflict positioning and being able to hold things at risk. And I want to sort of try to drill down from the conceptual to the potentially the very practical. I mean, we're just a year out from 2027. 1 August 2027 is the be ready by date, not necessarily the go by date. But, you know, if you could sort of best guess, you know, what is D-Day or D-Day minus 1 or 2 in terms of prepping the battle space? What might we expect? And I might ask Dr. Lohn to also contribute to this, because I sense maybe a little bit of difference. I don't know if you all want to explore that or start taking swings at one another, but Dr. Lohn, you suggested that there are red lines that China has respected. And I think you mentioned they wouldn't do water plants because for fear that retaliation might be outside of cyber. Do you think that the red lines would apply in the case of conflict? Do you think, I think you mentioned red lines a second time just now. Is it worthwhile communicating to China through official channels in advance what those lines might be from our perspective? I mean, I was not one of the optimists in the Obama administration when they had the deal. And took some heat from friends in the Obama administration when I said I thought it was foolish and not going to work. But, you know, presumably, if you think the Chinese are open to setting red lines from themselves, then they'd be open to receiving our communication as related to that. So, Mr. Lin, maybe begin with what you might actually expect in the very sort of concrete. If there were kinetic action, how might this particular capability contribute or augment to the kinetic activity in the Taiwan Strait?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me start there, and then also happy to chime in on red lines and enforceability and all of that fun stuff. So I think in the run-up to a conflict, and then on D-Day itself, China really would have two objectives, right? One is to be able to disrupt our ability to project force. Ultimately, there is the tyranny of distance that we have to deal with that they do not. And so, being able to field forces, whether that's from Guam, from Hawaii, from the continental United States, that is the American way of war. And so anything that they can do to disrupt mobilization on that front, they will almost certainly do. I would expect them to go after our logistics networks. We rely extensively on commercial providers, commercial logistics providers, even today. And we do all of that, oftentimes on unclassified networks, understandably so. They're not going to be doing this on SIPR or JWICs. And so if that's the case, then we have to take a very close look at the resilience of those networks, the strength of those networks, ensuring that they are not compromised, that they cannot be compromised. That's probably the most effective way to disrupt the actual military component of anything that we do, in addition to the kind of the social and political warfare that they would be waging against us at home in order to sap public support for our actions. And we know that this is what they'll do. They've written about it publicly, going all the way back to unrestricted warfare, which at the time, I think for a very long time, people dismissed as hyperbole. It was just the work of two senior colonels. It was a thought project that, their version of the NDU, and people were debating for a very long time, well, it was published by China's NDU press, not by the Academy of Military Sciences, and so we don't have to take it too seriously. I think at this point, that debate is over. That is how they think. Those ideas continue to permeate throughout Chinese military strategy, what they talk about. So that's the first part. The second part, I think, comes down to red lines. I like the idea of red lines. I'm not opposed to them in theory. The problem with red lines is that you have to be able to enforce them. And one of the key distinctive qualities of the cyber domain is that it's very, very, very hard to enforce red lines. And part of this has to do with the deniability of actions. And also, quite frankly, if we wait until they actually carry out the action, it's a little bit too late for us to enforce the red lines. And so the red line, should have been, well, you cannot pre-position malware in our critical infrastructure networks ever in civilian critical infrastructure networks. And if you do, there will be punishments. Because what they've done is effectively, strapped explosives, the digital equivalent of explosives, to critical infrastructure and said, oh, no, don't worry, we're not going to set it off. Why would you even do that if you have no intent of using it?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we actually disagree that much, but I'll play it through. I'm maybe a little bit skeptical that we can prevent them from taking these cyber actions purely on a cyber basis of our own. And so the red line I was thinking is like, at what point would their incursion or attack cause us to go outside of the cyber domain and come back with missiles or something like this? And so I think that. I think that cutting off our power infrastructure would get us out of that, and so they won't cross that unless they're really motivated to. Now, if we're in a crisis, maybe I'll step back before that. Before crisis, I think that they already have achieved some deterrent effect against us, and some other countries have, because we would think about whether they would turn off things if we were to do stuff. And so I think that already exists, and we should recognize that as the case. Now, if we're at the crisis standpoint where missiles are already flying or people are already being sent around, then they have less of a reason not to turn it off, and it might be a step on the ladder. It's like we can flash your energy infrastructure. Now, I would also like to go back historically to try to set this in the context. I don't think that it's exactly a China problem. That's not where we failed the deterrence on this. Russia has been in our grids for well over a decade, and they pulled power twice on Ukraine long ago, and so I think that's where we failed to set this as a boundary that shouldn't be crossed. But on the optimistic side, if we're talking about a short duration leading up to a crisis, we can also look to how challenging it was for Russia to implement their cyber attacks in the Ukraine invasion. in 2022. And so if you have to keep them out of a network for eternity, that's a difficult problem. If you just need to turn off their ability to attack you over a 1-week period, I'm more optimistic about our ability to do that.
Next up will be Commissioner Schmavonian, who is joining us virtually.
Thank you. Really eye-opening discussion, and appreciate everyone's time. One of the benefits of going at the end is most of your questions have been asked already, so I'm going to pull this back a little bit and just ask the panel two more broad-based questions. One, what in your view is the biggest blind spot defensively for the United States, either government or industry? And then two, what are our largest gaps offensively? And we can just go down the panel.
I think that we have a variety of blind spots in how large or effective the theft is on the AI domain. I don't know that we have a good understanding of how many chips are being smuggled, and I think that will be a challenge that we can try to address, perhaps with more BIS, perhaps with location verification measures. And I think that we don't have a good understanding yet of how effective this distillation attack is. How much is the gap between our leading performers and Chinese leading performers a result of them stealing our data compared to their own indigenous ability to keep up? So, and then I think that we also have perhaps an enduring gap about how capable are we at defending against these distillation attacks. These models need to be served in order to be profitable. The attacks themselves look very similar to normal operations and don't require that many accounts in order to pull them off. And so understanding what is the scale of theft and how much of an uplift it is, and where we can inject ourselves to upend their operations are our biggest gaps today.
As somebody who spends most of my waking hours thinking about cyber warfare, one of the things that I think is not necessarily a blind spot that the government has, but I think more broadly American society has, is around the sheer speed, scale, and sophistication of Chinese cyber operations in the United States. This is obviously a highly technical matter. It's a complex subject, but I think we have to do a far better job of communicating the scale of the threat and the implications of what this means for the American public. And we have to do it today. And I think that this is something that should prompt Congress to hopefully take far greater action in this space.
Rounding out from a commercial, trade and security perspective, I think the biggest blind spot as I see it vis-a-vis US-Chinese tech competition is on the foundational issue of Chinese government access to data and what that actually looks like in practice, and what is the nature of the relationship in practice between the Chinese government and these tech firms, and providing greater information and transparency about that, because that is foundational to our efforts to counter them, and as it relates to concerns about resilience and trustworthiness. I think from an offensive perspective, from a commercial, trade and security perspective, the biggest gap we have at the moment is having a coordinated strategy and set of tools to counter China's ability to leverage price as their key differentiator to enter and seize market share overseas, and doing more with capacity building and technology and such with these foreign government officials and procurement officials who just don't have the expertise or the capacity to assess non-price factors. In that, Chinese firms succeed because they can come in with a really low upfront price, low investment costs, and highly visible training commitments, but then the longer-term risk, resilience, ecosystem lock-in, state access things are much harder to measure and cost. And so we need to do a better job of highlighting what the full sort of life cycle costs of choosing a Chinese provider is before they just get suckered by the upfront visible cost differentiator that the Chinese excel at using.
Great, thank you. One quick follow-up, changing topics a bit. We have a number of ISACs, information sharing and analytics centers. Do we have an ISAC for data? Do we need an ISAC for data? Do the existing ISACs get information to them related to data mining and data risks? I would love some insights to the extent you have it with respect to how the US government is supporting our industry and just the information sharing piece, if you have any.
I'm going to refer to one of Andrew's colleagues, Helen Toner's testimony last week, which I think is a critical issue in the context of adversarial AI distillation attacks, in that there clearly needs to be more thought put into the public-private, the ability for public-private coordination and information as it relates to this form of attack, in that this may be taking place now to some degree, but I understand that there's uncertainty of whether existing authorities are broad enough to allow them to share the type of information they want and for the industry itself to coordinate amongst itself. And I should mention both of these issues were flagged in the White House memo that came out last week in relation to the adversarial AI distillation attack. So I still think there's more for the US government to do to ensure that there's clear, open communication and information sharing amongst the industry and with the government.
Great, thank you. And thanks to the chair for letting me go a little over.
It is my great pleasure. Last but never least, Commissioner Stivers.
Thank you. I'd like to delve back into the kind of the heart of your testimonies regarding China's acquisition of data system. Mr. Cory, in particular, you stated that there are no restraints to the Chinese government access to Chinese companies' data, and I think you all agree with that. We know China's legal framework, whether it's the data security law, the cybersecurity law, the national intelligence law, all compel Chinese companies to provide data when asked for it. So my question to you all is this system a well-oiled machine that works with precision, or are there weaknesses that can be exploited? And maybe, Mr. Cory, we could start with you.
Yeah, that's, I mean, goes to my, the love that I would have for the request for the US government to delve into this, to bring some transparency to the nature of how this works in practice. You all, I'm sure, have heard many debates and discussions about the nature of the national intelligence law and the data security law and the standing provisions it provides the Chinese government. But what we still really lack is sort of a comprehensive assessment of like, well, how do we think this actually works in practice? And we've seen anecdotal data points over time come out regarding Chinese government and ByteDance relationships and what data is shared there. But these anecdotal data points point us towards what we think is happening, but we just don't have a comprehensive view of that central threat sort of relationship and process. And I think that's critical. I mean, it's funny, ironic, right? Like the US government being a champion for safeguards and protections around government access to data vis-a-vis obviously Schrems and Snowden and such. But ironically, the US's government's reaction to all of that is to actually put it in the top tier of models vis-a-vis transparency, safeguard and redress around government access to data. And so it's ironic that Europe obviously has not stepped into this gap, but like it's incumbent for US tech companies who are facing slander essentially in foreign markets because Chinese firms are pointing at the US and going, Cloud Act, government access to data, even though that's not how it works. Well, no one's pointing at them and the black hole, the legal black hole they operate in vis-a-vis Chinese cloud companies and how they work with the Chinese government.
Mr. Lin?
Yeah, so, you know, I think it's indisputable at this point that things like the data security law, national security law, these are valuable strategic levers for the Chinese government to pull on, and they do. You know, as to how successful holistically all of this is, how, in your words, is this a system that's a well-oiled machine? I think that's hard to say, But I will say there's valuable empirical evidence that we can look at. So if you look at the data compromise and leaks of a mid-tier defense cyber contractor called iSoon that happened about a year and a half, 2 years ago, you start to see some evidence of both not just how the national security law has been used to support them as a defense contractor, but also looking at things like military-civil fusion, where you've got one of their key backers being Qihu 360, which is a sanctioned company, but is effectively like the Chinese version of Kaspersky, right? And the type of support and assistance that they're able to receive, both from an otherwise commercial provider, and then use that to be able to support their military and intelligence apparatus. I think evidence like that is valuable, and it suggests that, again, we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which they will pull on these levers.
Okay. But we also shouldn't overestimate it either, right? Mr. Lohn?
You ask about vulnerabilities in their well-oiled machine. And I don't know about in the machine itself, but as they pull in data, maybe we can recognize that the CCP is more vulnerable to information than we are. And so AI is very difficult to control and to contain. It says things, whatever's in there, and people can grab it out. We have an opportunity to shape a little bit of the narrative worldwide, or even within China as we distribute their models. That's partly why they're blocking our models from being accessible there. They also would have noticed in the Anthropic leak recently that there was some code written in there to try to poison models that were trying to do distillation. And so there's at least one flag that they would have noticed, that we are taking offensive action, the companies are taking offensive action to disrupt the data that flows into their systems.
Okay, thank you.
We have a few additional minutes for any commissioners that have questions, some final questions. I'm going to kick us off because I want to keep going down that line about distillation. We know it's a problem. The U.S. government's called out companies like DeepSeek for doing this to our large AI companies. But I thought, Dr. Lohn, you had a very interesting section in your testimony where you said, we may not know how to deal with it. It is not certain whether it's prohibited by the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act related to cyber attacks. It's not certain whether it is prohibited by the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And it is not certain whether it amounts to economic espionage according to Title 18. I'd like to ask each of the panelists, what do we do? What should the U.S. Congress do about the problem, the growing problem of distillation?
I'll start. I mean, talking to a Frontier lab earlier this week about the issue, they recognise it's obviously a growing interest on the Hill. Their reaction was that we should obviously ease into our response of it to fully understand the scope, scale, nature of the risk in order to avoid misreacting and thereby undermining sort of US AI. And it comes back to the point, I think, and again, I'm going to quote Andrew's colleague here just because I thought her testimony last week was so good, but like looking at this holistically in terms of like what can be done about preventing distillation as part of protecting the full pipeline of US AI IP, and that countering distillation should just be one measure amongst many to protect the AI ecosystem. But that I think the starting point for all of this, back to my prior points, is deepening and expanding security-focused collaborative arrangements between the US government and the AI companies, making sure there's a legal architecture for that so everyone's clear exactly that they can do that. And then providing antitrust guidance to enable US AI companies to collaborate on defensive measures as another sort of current gap. And then combining that with law enforcement and intelligence collection tools to improve our understanding of Chinese efforts. Again, just to get a better understanding of the threat picture. And that from there, more substantive legislative and policy changes will likely come, but that's the sort of foundational starting point, as best I understood it. And the final comment from the Frontier Lab was like, this obviously is only going to get worse. This is obviously a major concern, but we need to sort of slow our roll in how we react to it and do it systemically and coordinated so that we get it right.
Yeah, Kyle Miller, who's back here, and I have been talking about this a bunch. He's been leading our efforts at CSET. There are a couple things. One, he scoured the academic literature, and the answers are uncertain. And so we don't know how big of a threat this really is. And so if you can support research at large scales on newer models, that would be helpful. But we went through, it struck me that in these calls from the companies, they were asking for investment from to build larger models, but they weren't saying we can defend this in these ways. And so I'm trying to look, I'm questioning whether they can, and I'm trying to look how big of a problem is that, or how challenging is defense. We were doing back of the envelopes yesterday, actually, to see what fraction of the total user base is being used for distillation, what fraction would you need, how big is the haystack, how small is the needle, and how differentiable are the queries. And it came out less impossible than I anticipated, but very challenging. And so I think that I would ask you to push on the companies and say, can you pull this off? Can you actually defend this? And because it's not Congress's job to come up with the technical defenses, but maybe it is to say, are these sufficient for us to justify our investments? Separate from that, if that's a challenging case, then at the millions or the trillions of tokens standpoint, and if the haystack is too big on the end point, then you might have to look more at the front point, defending forward, to say, where are these attacks coming from? Can we disrupt them using our national technical means?
Okay. Commissioner Slevin.
Thanks. This could be brief probably, but the last month China launched the World Data Organization. I think it was referred to in at least one of your testimonies, intended to shape global data governance, maybe establish norms. It's very early, obviously, but what would you look for to see if this is the kind of thing that gets any traction? And how should the U.S. respond or try to compete?
Yeah, no, an interesting development, and I was talking to some US and other foreign government officials about it. They're obviously taking a keen interest in it. It's interesting because of its lack of context. Quite often China announces these major initiatives, the Global Data Security Initiative, and it launched a cross-border data flow initiative a couple of years ago, and they're all generally in a context. This one is sort of weirdly not. And so it's unclear just how much emphasis and how important it actually is. But it's certainly gotten everyone's attention for what it could potentially be as a platform for international engagement. And it's even unclear as to whether it's government and private sector, or is it only private sector? Is it civil society? Like, it's unclear of what its membership will be made up of and what its actual work agenda will do. And so I think for the Commission and for the US government, it's obviously something to watch very closely, how it evolves, how they use it, how extensively they draw folks into it, how connected it is to their domestic apparatus in terms of getting them to focus on standards and laws and regulations that obviously reflect Chinese preferences. But I think, and I mean, I think one way to look at it is that it's China's effort to change the normative discussion around global data governance in a way that reflects their preferences. And in talking to folks that deal with Chinese officials in many multilateral bodies, it's something China has really struggled with. They are far stronger on a restrictive, defensive basis because that lends to their strengths of sovereignty and control. But in terms of setting a constructive, positive vision for how China wants to see global data governance, they obviously really struggle because they love control, and that's at odds with it. And so it will be interesting to see whether they pick up and run with it, whether they seed it at UN discussions and other regional bodies, like how sort of comprehensive the push around the World Data Organization is. And if in 12 months' time we see they've seeded it across multiple forums and they've held many meetings, and it's like, okay, this is a real thing that they are operationalizing.
Thanks. Any additional comments?
Not much. I would just say that maybe it fits in as a part of a larger campaign that I'm hearing about, where they are trying to influence standards across a wide spectrum of areas, and we're seeding a lot of that by withdrawing ourselves at the same time.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Vice Chair Kuiken.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Miller, and thank you. I heard Commissioner Shriver, thank you for your testimony. I want to make sure I do it too. It's been an absolutely fantastic panel, so thank you. Commissioner Slevin decided to go after the World Data Organization questions. I appreciate that one. One of the things that Commissioner Shriver and I have been talking about when we do various events is this idea of convergence and adoption. And so what I've been saying is the watchword for 2026 is convergence. And the reason I say that is there's this incredible sort of amount of accumulating data. We now have embodied AI, creating more data. And we have these models that are becoming increasingly effective. And so over time, more data, better models, these things are going to start converging with biotech, advanced materials, quantum science, whether it's compute, communications, or sensing. How should we think about sort of convergence and adoption here in the US? Is it just better data strategy, going back to sort of what we were talking about earlier? Is it trying to prevent the Chinese from doing convergence and adoption? I don't think that's feasible. Is it more money for the sciences that are not AI, because sort of the AI flywheel is going, and now we need to think about how we think about biotech and pharmaceuticals and all these other areas? Just welcome your views on this. Anyone who wants to answer can go, and then I got one more question.
I mean, it is the flywheel, and it's the nature of network effects just being supercharged in the age of AI. I mean, there's been a long-standing debate about, obviously, China's natural sort of data resource domestically, and the fact that they've long put up walls around it. And so from a quantity perspective, they've always had a lot. But quality matters more so in terms of AI model training. And so that's why I think their restrict outflows, maximize inflows is important for their strategy, because they need that diversity more so than US firms who are just naturally global, and building a more comprehensive representative data set for training. I think from a US government perspective, it's about where there are conflicts to or barriers to convergence in specific sectors, then that should be something to take a specific look at, so that it's the individual firms are operating in a vacuum, that they can work with partners, they can work with NIST, they can work with Commerce to figure out, okay, how do we aggregate and share and maximize the value of the data we have to some extent. I think that, again, that's a common theme in my advocacy for a US data strategy and such, taking a far more targeted approach for US government intervention. I mean, again, but it's also doing everything the US government can to support its firms competing for market share around the world, because the future data set they use is in play now, and ensuring that Chinese firms aren't able to use the unfair advantages they get at home to seize market share over US firms using all their tips and tricks. And so it's about ensuring the US's data lead, for the lack of a better phrase, is that they maintain that in foreign markets.
That's helpful. If you guys want to, I have one more question, but go ahead.
I might add quickly that I don't think convergence means centralization necessarily. We look at these big AI model providers and think that they're the whole story, but I think that a lot of the convergence will happen at lots of very small players who figure out how to use that model for their application. Now, the types of defenses that you would implement for those are different. You can't just target the big ones and say thou shalt. You'll need to uplift the whole level. A lot of that happens at places like CISA, doing what are the known exploited vulnerabilities lists and the critical CVEs list, and NIST lifting up regulations and guidance overall.
Mr. Lin, or Dr. Lin, you're one of the first witnesses I've heard talk about Title 10, Title 18, and Title 50 all in the same breath. It was refreshing to hear, so you definitely know the nuances of the American government and cyber operations. I was listening to the conversation about distillation, and I was remembering one of the first accounts I worked on when I was on the Armed Services Committee was the IED Defeat Organization. And one of the things that I learned over the years of working on that account was there is a measure-countermeasure cycle that goes very quickly when you're in conflict. And distillation is a countermeasure to some of the measures that the US government deployed to sort of constrain the Chinese ability to accelerate in AI. So as we continue to do export controls, they'll continue to sort of pursue distillation until we find a counter to distillation. There will not be sort of the next cycle. So as we think about distillation, I do think we have to get after that problem, but I also think we need to be thoughtful about how we do it and make sure that whatever we decide to do is effective. And on that point, Dr. Lin, one of the things that I've heard you sort of talk around, and Commissioner Miller just talked around it a little bit as well, is at what point does the U.S. government just need to decide that we're going to conduct cyber operations against Chinese companies?
I mean, I think the time should be now. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about, I think we're still wrestling through is how do we better protect ourselves? And I think that that's, obviously very important, and I don't want to discount that. But I think, again, at the end of the day, cyber is one of these things where so far, at least, the curve has been, we spend more and more on cybersecurity and on data protections year over year, and somehow the results get worse and worse, right? And that's a cost curve, we're on the losing end of that cost curve. And so I think the question that we should be asking ourselves is, what is it going to take to change that, right? Because at some point, we will just spend ourselves into oblivion while, not necessarily improving the results. And so when we look at ultimately thinking just very simply about how do we change adversary behavior, protection, defense alone is just not enough. We have to be thinking holistically across the entire spectrum of capabilities that we have. Now, to be clear, I am not suggesting that we don't conduct offensive cyber operations. I think the key point here is that when we think about the types of operations that we're conducting, they simply cannot be done in a one-off fashion, right? We have to be thinking holistically, how do we build a system with both people, organizations, authorities, and capabilities that enables us to campaign offensively, and campaign being the operative word here.
Commissioner Hodges will bring us home.
Thanks again for everyone. So building off of a couple of the questions that were asked by Commissioner Slevin and Commissioner Kuyken, earlier, Mr. Cory, Mr. Lohn, you spoke about sort of efforts to set the architecture framework on tech data for the next 10 years. I think it was you, Mr. Cory, who used sort of that time frame, specifically with the idea of setting standards that are favorable towards the Chinese preferences. What's the time frame on this? Is it a year, 2 years, 3 years? Are we looking at a matter of months here? Because I've had conversations that kind of seem quite alarming to me, and so interested for your perspective.
It's a good question. I do a lot of work on technical standards, and it's something that China has prioritized and supported for some years now, but through somewhat ineffective measures, subsidizing engagement and providing prizes for submissions. And so the quantity over quality. But as soon as they submit it to the standards body, wherever it may be in Switzerland, they're out shopping the next day because they've gotten their bounty and they've got back. They're increasingly sophisticated and better at it, and in sectors where they are closer to the leading edge, like in physical AI, they will be the ones at those bodies having real impact on standards, so I imagine it's happening now. The closer they are to the edge, where they have that technical tacit knowledge, is where they'll be having the greatest influence on the setting of technical standards. And that's just going to be happening across the board. But that's to say, I mean, standards setting is America's sort of superpower that's unrecognised. American firms are incredibly good at it and have been doing it for decades, and they remain good at it. But China recognises it's something they're weaker at, but there is a concerted, ongoing government effort to support Chinese engagement and influence. The easiest thing that most researchers focused on is Chinese leadership of standards bodies, because that's easy to measure, but that doesn't equate to influence. And what matters is the technical merit of the submissions they make, and in a growing range of technologies, they're getting better at that.
Yeah, thank you. What would you say, or I guess this is a question for all of you, sort of the gap between sort of the U.S. lead when it comes to sort of 6G technology and Chinese technology is, how far apart are we in that regard? Mr. Lowe?
I would have to get back to you. I haven't caught up recently on 6G. we can get back.
All right, thanks.
That's the same, outside of the domain of my expertise.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our three witnesses. We're going to take a 10-minute break and return at 11:25 for panel 2.
Welcome back. As panel 2 gets seated, we'll begin shortly. The next panel is titled China's Data Acquisition and Practice, Vectors, Targets, and Implications for the United States. With us this morning, Dr. Gregory Falco, Assistant Professor at the Sibley School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Cornell University. We have Dr. Chris Miller, Professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. We have Diane Staheli, Senior Staff Member, Cybersecurity and Information Services Division at MIT's Lincoln Labs. And finally, we have Mr. Edward Yu, founder of EHY Consulting. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. We can get started with Dr. Falco.
Commissioners Miller, Slevin, and members of the Commission, thanks so much for the opportunity to testify today. As an engineering professor, we build defense and aerospace systems for our national security ecosystem. And my testimony is based off of some of the threats that we've discovered as we build new secure by design systems that others are doing to us. The central point that I want to make is that China's data strategy is moving from stealing information to modeling behavior. China is not only trying to collect high-value data, but they're very interested in low-level telemetry, powered traces, system log files. That becomes interesting only at scale. So the target is not really our behavior, but it is our data in concert with the context of our behavior. Let me start with some examples at the tactical edge. So drones. The most valuable data from a drone is actually not the imagery you might grab. It's not from the payload itself. The metadata from the drone tells you about how the system lives, how it operates. GPS positioning, RF transmissions, power consumption, and motion data can really reveal what we are intending to do with these systems. So for example, a system that holds position with a stable power draw can indicate persistent surveillance of an operation, whereas burst movements and fluctuating power can indicate evader pursuit or testing regimes. The patterns are not really theoretical. These are observable and they're repeatable. And that's what makes them interesting. So at scale, they allow our adversaries to interpret what our capabilities are and what we want to do. We're generating the data on a regular basis that adversaries are interested in just because we're using our systems, just because we're going through our operations. And what's really changed is the ability to analyze this data at scale. Historically, the bottleneck was the human operator, the human interpreter. But now we have machine learning algorithms that are able to ingest massive amounts of data, and then we can contextualize that data with things like LLMs that would help us to really interpret what's being used and why we care about these systems. The systems that they're collecting on do not require perfect data. They can be very messy, but we can still extract patterns and insights, and that's where the concern is. AI is starting to turn data exhaust into actionable intelligence. And the same pattern we see appear outside the tactical edge in scientific infrastructure. Now, don't get me wrong, as a scientist, I'm not arguing that scientific collaboration is inherently malicious, and the risk is not the science itself, but there's risk in that persistent scientific infrastructure is persistent sensing infrastructure in locations that might be geopolitically interesting. So China is really heavily investing right now in research stations in places like the Arctic and the South China Sea, where they would like to have persistent sensing and surveillance. And they're framing these as, oh, we want to do ionospheric monitoring for space science. But what are you really looking at? You're looking at when rockets are launching and when we're doing maneuvers on orbit. They might be looking at subsea mapping to say, oh, we want to know where mining operations are or how the climate's changing. But no, they're trying to look at where our cables are so they can cut them at the right time. The issue here is control of this data and who stores it, how it's released, and who they're collaborating with at what time. And we need to be on top of this. The logic that I'm presenting extends into space as well. China's not just tracking our spacecraft, but through proximity operations, they can observe how our spacecraft respond to different stimuli. A system approaches our spacecraft, it triggers a response, and then it gets to observe what happens. It reveals operational thresholds that we care about and our system behavior. And at the foundation of all of these technologies are our semiconductors. And every system will generate every semiconductor will generate electromagnetic emissions, power traces, and timing behavior. And these signals, when a system's active, we know what it's doing based off of these emissions. The risk is not about the compromise of the chips. It's about the observability of the chips to be able to interpret what's actually happening. And we've been spending decades and billions of dollars trying to secure access to things, but we're not necessarily obfuscating observability. So this leads to the central concept that I want to present, which is China really cares about pattern of life. By observing behavior over periods of time, they can infer purpose and our roles and our future actions. And this is about anticipating what we can do and what we will do, not just about observing things at the current state. It represents a much broader shift in intelligence gathering. And historically, intelligence gathering was based off of human intelligence, classified collection, direct compromise, but that's not how we do it anymore. We could do this by derived data flows from aerospace and defense systems that are pretty freely observable. To respond effectively, I'd like to highlight a couple of priorities. First, we need to strengthen restrictions on high-risk foreign components. We've already done this through the National Defense Authorization Act from December, where we've seen the limitations of Chinese components in drones. We need to double down and do this for more sectors. But we also need to pair these with viable alternatives that will not compromise our existing supply chains, which we kind of are seeing as a result of the December restrictions. We have a long way to go. Second, we need to reinvest in dual-use science and global presence. The reason why is because China's filling gaps that we've left. They're populating remote research environments, and we need to expand international partnerships so that we have access to the data that they would have had if they jump in there. Finally, we need to promote secure by design through standards and procurement. We have to build these systems secure from the start and prevent observability, not just access. So in closing, I'd like to present three core takeaways here. First, data exhaust is now about intelligence gathering. Second, AI has removed the bottleneck to exploiting data at scale. And finally, this is a competition about data aggregation, not specifically about access. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Miller?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to join the commission today and testify on the topic of connected cars. And I commend the commission for tackling this topic right now, given the extent to which connected cars and foreign investment is in the news just this week. What I'd like to suggest to you today is that we should see modern automobiles not just as forms of transportation, but as sensor platforms that are gathering a wide variety of data, storing it and transmitting it in ways that create risks, both of espionage but also of sabotage. Most people think of cars just as the device that gets them to and from their place of work or the places that they're going, but modern automobiles can't function without dozens of different types of sensors. Traditionally, most of the sensors inside of a car were analyzing the car's own operations, monitoring the engine, for example. But over the last decade, we've seen a proliferation of sensors across cars, both to monitor the drivers themselves and also to map the external world. And this has brought to the fore a series of data governance concerns that I believe the automotive industry is not on its own properly grappling with and requires government action to monitor and to address potential risks. So first, to lay out the types of sensors that we ought to be worried about. We all know that cars have GPS sensors that track location, and this alone could be a valuable asset for an adversary. But more interesting are the sensors that look inside and outside of cars. Many cars, for example, have camera sensors and audio sensors that monitor the driver, listen to a driver giving voice commands to the car, for example, or notifying the driver when it looks like they're no longer paying attention to the road. But of course, cameras and audio sensors inside of cars could also be valuable sources of intelligence for a foreign adversary. In addition to this, there are an increasing number of sensors outside of cars, LiDARs, cameras, radars, and other sensors that are mapping the external world. And this is a very important development. It's driving increasingly autonomous capabilities in the automotive sector, but it raises questions about where this data is going and who has access to it. I certainly wouldn't support any limitations on the gathering of this data by companies, but we must ask questions about who has access to the data once it's gathered. It could be very useful, for example, to a foreign intelligence service if they had almost real-time visibility into who was driving by certain types of critical infrastructure, for example. It's been reported by some cybersecurity researchers that certain types of automotive cameras can not only see the world, they can identify license plate numbers or have facial recognition capabilities. And so the intelligence implications of this data is, I think, increasingly significant as more and more cars are deployed with a larger number of sensors. And just reading the news, we see many examples of this type of data being used by different governments around the world for intelligence purposes. It's been reported just in the last couple of weeks that Israel hacked into Iranian traffic cameras to track the movements of senior Iranian leaders. Both Russia and Ukraine are alleged in media reports to have undertaken similar types of cyber attacks against each other. And if these countries are doing it, we should assume that China is doing it as well, which raises the question of what are the steps that we could take to mitigate against these risks. And it's worth noting that our European allies, as well as Israel, have been increasingly taking steps to examine the cybersecurity implications of connected cars and to mitigate against them by imposing data protection rules or by not allowing certain types of critical components to be sourced from foreign adversaries. It's been reported, for example, that multiple European governments have advised military personnel not to drive Chinese-made cars onto military bases or near sensitive military facilities. And China itself has, over the last several years, restricted where certain American-made cars can drive within China, evidence that Beijing takes seriously exactly this type of risk. So I think it's high time that we take seriously the espionage implications as well. And listening to my fellow panelists talk about China's data aggregation strategy, automobiles are certainly an important part of this effort. If the first risk is espionage, the second risk, I think, is sabotage, because cars today are increasingly software defined, which raises questions of who can update the software. This is important both for the operating systems of cars, but also in particular for the software that manages the battery management system. And in particular, when I read news headlines about automakers considering joint ventures or partnerships with Chinese battery manufacturers, I think we should be asking very careful questions about who controls the software that dictates how the battery operates. It's been widely discussed, for example, that a compromised battery management system could cause a battery to set on fire, which of course would not be a good thing if it was inside of your car. And so, although it sounds perhaps extreme to worry about sabotage in automobiles, I think it's not difficult to imagine scenarios in which thousands or even millions of cars halting on our streets could be an obvious tool for a foreign adversary, and China is certainly considering these capabilities. So the espionage and the sabotage risks, I think, are real, and they deserve to be addressed. And there are several capabilities we have to begin to address them. The first is an authority called ICTS at the Commerce Department, which has been used in the past couple of years to restrict the sourcing of certain components as well as software from Chinese firms for deployment in American automobiles. The connected car rule, as this is referred to, is, I think, a very targeted measure that only focuses on connectivity equipment that's relevant for automobiles, as well as software written by Chinese providers, and it limits their use in automobiles sold in the United States. I think this is an important effort, and it should be strengthened and expanded, in particular by providing codification for ICTS, which currently has as its legal authority an executive order, but which I think should be codified by Congress. Second, we need to think more carefully about encouraging our allies to take similar measures, because just as we face risks, so too do our allies, and many of our allies have more Chinese cars on their roads than we do. That's true in Europe, it's true in Australia, it could soon be true in Canada as well, where these countries have become increasingly reliant on Chinese cars. And so in sum, I think we must take the risk of the data collected by automotive components seriously. We must take seriously also the risk that if we're sourcing key components and key software from China, that this prevents a significant risk of both espionage and sabotage. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Ms. Staheli?
Thank you to the Commission for having me here today to speak about Chinese data strategy, advanced artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity. As the Commission's previous report has noted, China's approach to artificial intelligence is built on an open model strategy and dominance in manufacturing, creating a feedback loop that enhances its long-term AI competitiveness. By promoting open models that are inexpensive to deploy and customize, Chinese firms make it easier to integrate AI into industrial settings like factories, logistics, and robotics. These deployments generate vast amounts of real-world data, which can be used to train and improve models. Access to large-scale, real-world interaction datasets could give China a competitive edge in developing the next generation of large language models. Many researchers predict future advancements in LLMs will depend on three key areas: richer real-world awareness, stronger multi-step reasoning, and physical intelligence, or the ability to act through machines in the physical world. Domains like robotics, autonomous systems, and code generation are already benefiting enormously from this type of data. China's regulatory environment amplifies its data advantage. Privacy protections and norms are much less restrictive than in the US or the EU, particularly in areas like e-commerce and public security. This allows for large-scale ingestion of biometric data, video feeds, and location histories into AI pipelines. Chinese AI firms also benefit from access to state-collected datasets and commercial data from apps, payment systems, and logistics platforms. This creates a rich corpus for training models in areas like facial recognition, crowd analysis, and vehicle tracking, all of which have commercial and state security applications. China's state strategy further aligns public and private interests in AI. Data is treated as a strategic national resource, and organizations are incentivized or compelled to share data sets and models across sectors. This accelerates progress at a system level. In contrast, US entities often treat data as proprietary, with regulatory and business constraints limiting cross-sector sharing. Even if US organizations collectively hold more data, it's harder to combine and reuse at scale for national AI objectives. Export controls on advanced hardware have slowed China's progress on frontier AI models, but the gap is narrowing. Chinese labs have optimized software and model architectures to maximize efficiency on available hardware, achieving significant gains without large accuracy losses. Additionally, evidence of intellectual property theft through distillation-style attacks on used closed-source models has been observed. These adaptations, combined with China's data advantages and coordinated strategy, could allow it to close much of the capability gap in real-world applications, even if it lags behind on frontier benchmarks. Data poisoning attacks exploit the vast data sets used to train LLMs by injecting malicious or biased data. For example, attackers could plant fabricated information on public platforms that organizations scrape for training data. This could subtly manipulate a model's behavior, such as associating neutral terms with negative connotations or embedding trigger phrases to elicit specific responses. Detecting poison data is challenging due to the scale of the training sets and the subtlety of the attacks. Poison data may constitute only a small fraction of the corpus, making it difficult to identify. It's important to note that data poisoning is a general security concern in machine learning and not unique to any specific country. However, US reliance on a small set of web scraping providers creates a systematic vulnerability. China's open source AI ecosystem accelerates innovation, but also introduces security risks. Companies often build on each other's models, including US developed ones, creating derivative models that can cross borders. A single security flaw in model code or tools can propagate across organization and products, complicating vulnerability attribution and remediation. Again, this isn't unique to China, but it's broadly true of the open source software ecosystem. Open source platforms are also attractive targets for bad actors. Malicious code can be embedded in model repositories or scripts and redistributed as legitimate contributions. Organizations should treat AI artifacts as software supply chain components, and by applying standard security controls like scanning, provenance tracking, and other best practices. The combination of emerging model security tools and existing practices can help mitigate some of these risks. Organizations often seek the best AI performance at lowest cost. Non-frontier models that deliver competitive performance at reduced costs may be more attractive for startups, small business, and governments with limited resources, especially those in regions or countries that have a mobile-first innovation strategy. This reflects a natural progression of technology where advancements eventually become accessible to broader audiences at lower price points. Open models, cloud APIs, and embedded AI and commodity hardware are accelerating this trend. In addition to benchmarks, cost should be treated as a predictor of China's global AI diffusion. To better assess model capability in general and to ensure better model security, we need further advancement in measurement and testing infrastructure. Benchmarking AI models is useful, but it currently lacks standardization. Many benchmarks are biased, oversaturated, or tailored to specific tests, which can inflate results without reflecting real-world performance. To address this, the field needs independent evaluators to administer benchmarks under transparent protocols and publish unbiased results. Investment in better measurement methods and reproducible testing infrastructure is also essential. Transparency from model providers is another key area for improvement. Standardized documentation, such as data and model cards, should describe training data sources and filtering processes. This would help detect data poisoning and systemic bias. Structured red teaming exercises and responsible disclosure of vulnerabilities are also critical for improving AI security. Finally, the AI community needs robust mechanisms for sharing information about threats and vulnerabilities. This includes publishing security reports, sharing indicators of compromise, and establishing formal channels for collaboration. Strengthening these practices will help build collective defenses against emerging risks in the AI ecosystem. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mrs. Staheli. Finally, Mr. Yu.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, Commissioners. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be able to present to you all. I benefit from going last, and I wanted to start by saying that I think we are very much crucially at an inflection point, that it's not just about data acquisition, but it's looking at data operability. And especially when it comes to China, I thought I would start by using biotechnology as a reference point and to provide some context. There's a reason, because China is intentional about looking at biotech and data specifically. Because if you look at what's happening right now, they are facing some real-world challenges. They're facing climate change, which is impacting food security. They're looking at workforce and population sustainability problems. They're looking at environmental remediation impacts because of their manufacturing scale over time. And especially with current events and looking at what's happening with the oil supply, they are facing major energy dependence issues as well. Biotechnology offers quite a bit of solutions with that. And so, for example, looking at healthcare, and I appreciate this, the Commission has provided reports on this, but the fact of the matter is that China's access to genetic data, not just in the US, but around the world, looking at even things like electronic health records, as was mentioned before, pattern of life, behavior information. What we're seeing right now is not just about them being able to provide antibiotics because we can't make them anymore. They dominate the generic pharmaceuticals, but we're also looking at next generation therapeutics like CAR T cell therapies or mRNA vaccines that are all basically AI enabled. As it stands right now, China is sponsoring more CAR T cell clinical trials than any other country in the world. And what's happening now is that we are sponsoring some of those clinical trials, and the resulting data and the trials that we're hosting here in the US coming from US patients is going back to China. That is not genetic information. That is not some of the sensitive data that our current policies are focusing on. However, clinical trial data is probably far more valuable and far more consequential, especially when you're looking at going into an AI flywheel to iterate and generate the next iteration of these therapeutics. That is really going to be impacting not only China's ability to take care of themselves, but translate that into how they deploy that and foster even more supply chain dependencies on the US and abroad. And I'll also now pivot to agriculture. We're seeing that now there too, that a combination of technologies like GPS systems. China has more GPS satellites than the US. That translates into more accuracy. It translates into the fact that China dominates globally the drone market in agriculture. And it's not just scanning and telemetry, but it's spraying. You combine that with China's logging for tracking overseas shipping, ZPMC cranes, rail, autonomous trucking. It is end-to-end full-stack logistics that combined with, again, an AI-enabled GMO crops, for example, seeds that are going to be genetically modified to become heat-resistant, drought-resistant. They are offering all that to, especially in the global south countries, where you're seeing the highest concentration of biomass and carbon. So think soy for biodiesel, corn for ethanol. They are able to provide that to particularly the BRICS Alliance member countries, especially other developing countries. We saw, for example, Angola leaving OPEC a few years ago because China's offering them advanced biotech and agriculture. We're starting to see at least 6 other African nations following suit. Brazil, China's even offering them their own dedicated satellites to launch into orbit to monitor their forestry, their farmland, their water usage. In all essence, everything is happening so that China is able to not only solidify their own supply chains for their own imports, whether it be looking at crops, which basically is marginalizing our farming sector. I'm not really sure what what the forecasts look like for our ability for our farmers to sell our soy and corn to China because they're able to diversify their own sources through South America. It becomes even more exacerbated because of the fact that due to the oil crisis, they're going to be looking at, well, even if the oil prices go down, one thing is lost now is the stability of the supply chain. So that makes even more renewed interest in renewables. And so suddenly, those countries in the global south that are potentially agriculture rich become incredibly viable for new carbon feedstocks. And again, this all translates into acquisition of data, translated that into being able to make it operable, translating that into products and services that they can offer to other countries, and in many ways bypass us. And on the flip side, the US is an enormous agricultural powerhouse, but we don't have the ability right now to translate the surplus that we now have there because China's not buying, to internalize that into our own economy and convert that into industrial chemicals, maybe not replace oil specifically, but at least make us more resilient. But what I'm trying to highlight to you all is that it's not just about access to data. It's not just about espionage. It's not just about some of the things that have been discussed over this morning. But it really is, how is the entity that can access the data and operationalize it and scale it faster than anybody else will give them the strategic advantage. And it can be from an intelligence standpoint, sure. It could be from a military standpoint, of course. But absolutely from an economic standpoint, China right now stands to take a significant strategic advantage. And from a policy standpoint, again, I'm going to be focusing on a biotech angle, is that one, we are not assessing the risk when it comes to biotechnology, especially when it comes to the convergence of artificial intelligence. Primary focus has been what? The generation or engineering of next generation bioweapons. Is that of concern? Of course it is. However, if that's the only framing of the scoping of our assessing of what our risks are, we are opening ourselves up to where we are right now. It also means that if we do assess the risks appropriately, we should be identifying new opportunity spaces. It's not about export control or trying to get back what we lost, but it also identifies new greenfield areas that we should be investing in, whether it's looking at talent development or infrastructure development, to ensure that we maintain our first mover advantage, because we are really at risk at losing that. So with that, I really thank the Commission for the time and welcome your questions.
Thank you all. Really excellent testimonies. I'll lead off the questions of this round. And I want to pick up on the pattern of life concept that was also raised in the first panel, which many points of that I personally find compelling. But some might push back on it as just overly theoretical at this point. And so I wanted to kind of pressure test it a bit, Dr. Falco, with you. Having data is not the same as understanding it. And I think from the commission perspective, where we advocate for policy recommendations, when we're working with Congress, and there's this always a fight for attention, political and policy attention. I kind of want to hear from you a little bit more as to what's out there, what's the evidence that suggests China has the analytical capabilities to turn data into meaningful intel. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I would say the first way I would answer that is we can do this. And if we can do this, I know they can do this, because I see it in the academic literature. I see things that were published 3 years ago, 5 years ago, describing side channel attacks, power traces, published by top Chinese universities. Now, can I guarantee you that that's worked its way into its tech ecosystem? No. But do I know that those universities are funded by their intelligence gathering complex? Absolutely. So I know those capabilities exist. I know that we actively test and do these things for our systems. Again, mostly to understand what the threats look like so we can redesign for better systems. But that's kind of the best I can give you, because I don't have a smoking gun saying I know they're doing this. But if I see it in the literature and I know that we're doing it, it just follows.
Thanks. Anyone else like to comment on the question?
I'm sorry, I sort of mentioned in my opening statements that we're seeing that in agriculture.
Right.
Right. So if the point of the fact is that China, as I mentioned, they're the only country that is providing agricultural drones globally on every continent. Whether it's DJI, Autel, or XAG, there really is no other competitor. And so if you're a farmer with limited resources, having these types of drones that collect the telemetry, that collects the mid-range infrared spectroscopy, that is able to enable precision spraying, which translates into a 30% drop in supply costs and a 60% savings in labor costs. So it's a win-win. They're providing a service that many of our farmers are not able to pass up because there's no alternative, and we're giving them our data. And that translates into, well, you're optimizing farming, you're potentially increasing yield, but at the same time, you're now fostering incredible dependencies on that capability. And that's something that it goes back to the risk assessment that we're not really paying attention to. And it's not just us. This is happening, especially in those agricultural-rich countries that I mentioned before.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Dr. Miller, I'm glad you raised the ICTS program at Commerce. I think that does not get as much attention as it should. The connected vehicles rule, to me, and I think you'd agree, is the clearest proof of concept, I think. Relative to other technologies, drones, spacecraft, wondering how you see that process around connected vehicles as being, applied to other platforms and technologies, and if anything, what needs to change, you think, at ICTS or from Congress? You mentioned codifying ICTS as being an important step. Tell us a little bit more as to why that's important.
Well, thank you for the question. I think the ICTS authority, as written, does enable a broad range of actions by the Commerce Department to address these types of risks in different sectors. I mean, thus far, we've seen only a small number of sectors actually tackled by ICTS, and there's been a significant slowdown the last year or so in terms of ICTS's action in addressing different sectors. But I think you're right to suggest that when we look across the industrial base and across consumer products, anything that has data gathering and connectivity capabilities is within the remit of what should be at least looked at to examine what are the risks. And it seems to me that we should be encouraging ICTS, both by codifying, but also by helping identify additional sectors that should be tackled. I'll give you one example. It's now abundantly clear that data center infrastructure is critically important for the future of technology, for the functioning of our economy. It seems to me very important to understand what are the risks of using certain types of critical Chinese equipment in our data center infrastructure. That would be a natural place for ICTS to do more work.
That's great. And you mentioned Europe and Israel as well as taking similar steps. What's the ideal kind of forum, you think? Like, who should be at the table if we were to try to have some alignment with countries around a set of rules like ICTS?
Well, it's a hard question because every government has a different set of regulatory authorities. Our friends in Europe, I think, have been very hesitant to call out China specifically when regulating these types of risks and prefer instead to talk vaguely about cybersecurity risks. And that's been a challenge because, of course, our rules do allow us to target countries of concern specifically. I think we have seen some positive developments in Europe in particular in terms of actually taking seriously these concerns in Norway, in Denmark, in Poland, in the UK, just the last couple of months. We've seen new public discussion as well as new governmental action to begin to tackle these topics, but I would say a lot more work needs to be done, both within these countries and then to align policies with us and our allies.
Great. Thanks very much. Commissioner Miller?
Thank you, Commissioner Slevin. I'd like to turn to biotech. Dr. Yo, you had mentioned in your some of your remarks the implications of the health of pharmaceutical data, other data. I want to ask the question a little bit more direct way. Right now, Western pharmaceutical companies are flooding into China right now for clinical trials, for early stage drug licensing. What are the implications here in terms of data accumulation and synthesis on the broader Chinese thrust to dominate biotechnology or biomanufacturing? Are we giving up something by going over there? What are the problems? Help talk us through this issue, please. And anyone else who's can weigh in on that is welcome to answer as well.
No, thank you very much for the question. I think in many ways the tables have turned. That historically it used to be U.S. and other pharma hoping to get into the Chinese market to get access to the 1.4 billion potential customers. I think post-COVID, the Chinese recognize that there was a significant benefit, not only for their own population, but commercially. And so you see that in their strategic plans. In their most recent 15th five-year plan they just released, you see a specific prioritization of biomanufacturing in pharma, in agriculture, in renewables. And so what I think is happening is that, as I mentioned, you're starting to see more Chinese startups coming up with new innovative drugs. And those are all, majority of them are being AI-enabled through the data that they have. What the tables have turned is that our other companies are now licensing those new candidate drugs to be able to bring into the market while the Chinese companies retain domestic control. So the paradigm has flipped. And the short term, it's a great potential windfall for the licensed companies that are able to achieve that license. But I don't think they are paying attention to what the long game is that, as you mentioned, that is access to more data that then gets iterated to generate the next tranche of innovative candidate drugs, or even more importantly, especially when you think about for cancer therapeutics, for very specific individualized treatments, long-term wise, we may be giving away the farm and not really recognizing that. And it kind of goes back to my original statement that we're just not doing the risk assessments appropriately. It's the same old thing. It's looking at it from a quarterly financial report rather than looking at what the long-term implications are.
I think you're right there. Companies are focused on short-term profits, and I think it's Congress's job to look at the long game, to look at the national security implications. So appreciate you bringing this to our attention. Ms. Staheli, talk to us about data poisoning attacks. How should we think about this? Obviously, it's a major problem, but is this sort of a problem that should be viewed holistically? Should it be viewed in terms of trying to find a solution or trying to find a way to plug up vulnerabilities, something that we should be looking at by sector because of the importance of the sector? Is it something that we should be talking to our top companies about, viewed on a company level? Help us think through this idea of data poisoning and how to defend ourselves against it.
Certainly. So data poisoning attacks are not just a consideration in terms of China. It's something that's broadly worried about in the community. It's not necessarily anything that's new. As I mentioned, there are most of the US models, as well as China, do train their models on one or there's one very specific data set that, and derivatives of that data set that are used in the training. So that's a place where anyone can go onto the internet, post documents, make social media posts, blog posts, videos, and the Crowell engine will come and ingest all of those documents. A sophisticated adversary could, in a coordinated manner, poison those data sets in as few as 250 documents. There was some research released recently that talks about that. But so could anyone else with bad intent. So there's much research that needs to be done there to figure out how do we discern a poison attack from someone spreading misinformation, or even AI-generated content could be something that creates these problems. And in general, these kinds of attacks may not even be intentional. In some cases, it might just be poor data quality. So we should be looking at more standardized ways to assess the data pipelines that these companies are using for training, looking at what are the best practices for cleaning, labeling data, to ensure that either intentionally or unintentionally, the models are being trained on the best approaches that we've seen coming out of the research.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Commissioner Stivers.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to turn to Chinese autos. Dr. Miller, a few years ago, members of Congress, pushed the Biden administration to impose a 100% tariff on Chinese autos into the United States. Having grown up in Detroit, I know firsthand how devastating that would be to the auto industry and to our economy as a whole. While I know this is not a hearing about trade, certainly the responses on data and trade are intertwined. And so my questions to you are twofold. First, well, there's also new legislation, which I think would strengthen some of the restrictions on components in Chinese vehicles. Wondered if you've had a chance to look at that legislation, and if there are there things in that legislation that could go farther that the Commission could push, would be my first question. My second question is, how can the U.S. response to Chinese state-subsidized vehicles be effective if there is no running faster component, which we didn't talk so much about in this hearing, but we're not going to be able to compete with these vehicles in Europe or throughout the world, or even Canada for that matter, unless we can provide a better alternative.
Well, I completely agree that you need to provide a better and price competitive alternative, and that has to, I think, increasingly rely on autonomy and the types of capabilities that sensor-powered cars enable. And so any regulatory steps that are taken needs to make sure it doesn't slow down that rate of progress. But I think we do nevertheless need to not only be concerned about not slowing down progress and also take seriously the risks that I outlined. And of course, listening to industry, at times there's only a focus on driving down cost, which is certainly important, and not a focus on addressing our security concerns. I would say when it comes to trade dynamics, I think it's critical to note that tariffs don't address these risks. Tariffs apply at the car level, not at the level of the sensors and the communications devices within cars. And so we need to be very precise and specific about what are the components that are most of concern. And I think the Department of Commerce was right to target connectivity components and software as the highest level of concern. I also mentioned in my testimony battery management systems. The software that goes around batteries is something that also should be specifically targeted, especially if and when U.S. automakers consider closer collaboration with Chinese battery makers, as has been discussed recently in the media. And so I do think expanding the scope of components that we focus on is the right direction of travel, but we need to be targeted at the restriction level and not count on tariffs or broad-based bans on Chinese cars, because it's easily conceivable that American or European and Japanese cars could also have problematic components inside of them.
Okay. Anything on the running faster part of it?
Well, I would just say that to reemphasize the central importance of enabling our firms to gather and utilize this data, we must not slow that down in any capacity.
Thank you. we spent a lot of time on the last panel talking about industrial espionage and IP theft and how to respond to it. But it seems like the larger problem, from what I'm hearing, is the legal acquisition of this low-level data and broader low-level data. My question are for anyone who wants to respond, but Mr. Falco in particular, to what extent have U.S. companies, through these data broker sales, joint ventures, cloud servicing agreements, that app distribution, functioned as unwitting or knowingly complicit with Chinese state or so-called Chinese private data collection? Dr. Falco, you said, we should double down on components restrictions, but, do we also need better disclosure requirements? I think a lot of these U.S. companies would respond if they have to disclose that they're entering into this agreement with a Chinese state-owned or so-called private company. Any thoughts on that?
I think American companies probably are very happy to be ignorant about what's happening when it comes to letting their data leak or go somewhere that might be into Chinese hands. Working with industry for my entire career, in and out of academia, I like running fast with scissors, like to your other question. And industry does too. What they don't want to start seeing is people telling you who you're allowed to run fast with scissors around. And I think the challenge that we're going to have here is to figure out how to not disable the innovation ecosystem and the commercial ecosystem that we rely on and the frankly, meritocracy that our companies are based on, while still giving the right restrictions to protect our national security. One thing I would offer is I spent a lot of time in Europe with different intelligence communities and different academics. What's been really stark recently is their lack of interest in using American software. So for example, the government of Denmark, I know this is not China, but the government of Denmark now is using Open Libra Office or something like that because they don't want to use Microsoft because they're pissed at us, right? And this is not a requirement, this is not a law that is in place. This is a pushback of sovereignty. And I don't know how we can properly recognize that same sentiment, but maybe that's the approach, which is less of a required law saying you can't do blah, 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 and instead moving towards, let's lead by example and have certain companies who are part of a coalition of the willing demonstrate how they should go approach this thing. So I think that's what's happening in Europe.
Thank you. Mr. Yu.
So if I may, I just want to kind of expand on that, and I kind of touched on it in my opening statement, but you really need to pay attention to what China is doing in the international standard making efforts. That they've been historically been called fast followers, but especially in light of their, as I said, data aggregation and the ability to operationalize it, I think they are evolving to become fast adopters. And what I mean by that is that they're developing the standards like places in like the World Radio Communication Conference, the International Telecommunications Union, International Civil Aviation Organization, but basically they are laying the groundwork for what the future looks like. And if they are able to define the standards and they adopt it, then everybody else is going to have to play by those rules as well too. And one of the things that you should be paying attention to is something that they've already determined as a priority is the low altitude economy. So this is everything below 400 feet, and that is not covered by the FAA. But so think of, drone delivered, Uber Eats or Grubhub or something along that line. It's building out that infrastructure, the technology to support that, and especially the guidelines and the regulations to support that. Because if you get that's basically the whole ballgame for the future of next generation commerce. And so you think about that, if they are able to influence that, then think of automated delivery of special diets or your prescription medicine. This transcends privacy, but it's also looking at the next level e-commerce built on this new technology that has even more data access that we are not paying attention to right now, because admittedly, we do need to look at what's happening now and how we're being hurt. But if we're not paying attention to strategically what their intentions are with, like as I said, they have drivers for why they need it to happen, but it also then potentially translates into other vulnerabilities that we're not assessing at this point. and we absolutely need to.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I went over.
Great, thank you, Commissioner. Chairman Shriver.
Your statements and the statements so far. Most of our hearings, it doesn't take too long till we get into deeper discussions about alliances, partnerships, cooperation, and there hasn't been as much in this hearing, although, Dr. Falco, you mentioned the NATO piece, given your focus on defense systems, and Dr. Miller, you talked about differing standards when it comes to importing connected vehicles and the like. But I wanted to give you each an opportunity to talk about that, the importance of alliance cooperation to address the areas in which you each have interests, and this notion of developing patterns of life, aggregation of data. I mean, is this something that we can be resilient on our own if we restrict and control and are resilient on American data? Is there an American gap, even if they're getting lots of data from elsewhere? But really the general topic of alliance and partner cooperation.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I want to double down on the notion of science diplomacy. And the reason why is because right now, especially in the current geopolitical posturing of the U.S. and just opposed to the rest of the world, we don't have a lot of common ground with some of our historic allies. And that for better or worse. We have our own interests and we have to pursue our interests. But one thing that has historically helped was to be able to find the off-nominal diplomacy conversations through science, which we've done a little bit of pulling back from. And the reason why I am mentioning this is because, as I described earlier in the testimony, we see scientific installations and research stations being used for dual use purposes in every manner. And our collaborators, our allies who we've historically done these missions with, these scientific research missions, have been very supportive of us doing things dual use in those places that we've been installing things with them. But when we aren't investing in that infrastructure anymore, and when there's new areas to explore and discover, and we're not there, they're going to do it with someone else. Take, for example, in Antarctica. That is all dual-use infrastructure, right? We think it's all science. It's not, right? We all know that there's a lot of things going on down there. And this is something where historically the National Science Foundation has pushed towards science installations. But we don't care as much right now about those installations from a science standpoint. But that means that we're losing visibility from an intelligence gathering and from a military standpoint. And especially posturing with our allies that we are showing we care about these areas. If we don't care, they're going to go somewhere else. So I think that's an angle that we really need to figure out how to double down on.
Well, I certainly agree with the importance of the question, and I would say there's two different dynamics that I would focus on. I think the first is the ability to aggregate data in third countries is both something we don't want China to have and that we want to have ourselves. And so it matters a great deal, I think, whose cars are driving around Europe's streets. It matters commercially because if our companies are getting access to that data, they can build better autonomous driving systems, whereas if China's are gathering that data, they have an advantage in terms of quantity of data. But of course, it also has intelligence implications as well. But the second implication, which is I think just as important, is the economic dynamics. If our companies are only selling critical components to the domestic market, that's a relatively small share of global GDP. And if China wins the rest of the world market for sensors, for communications equipment, but also for certain types of software, they have the scale to become more efficient over time. And that's why I think it is critical to align US, European, Japanese, and other countries' standards so that we have the bigger market along with our allies and can outcompete the Chinese in industries where scale does matter.
And I also want to provide a slightly different answer in that, if anything, it should be an indication of where we should be doubling down on, as was mentioned, investment in research and development, right? So it's the ability to run faster and not just play defense all the time. And that's important because, one, it's also working with our international partners to help them understand a lot of the vulnerabilities that I highlight, because we're not the only ones suffering from it. In many ways, our partners are probably getting hit worse in the data exfiltration. But then the existential threat, though, too, is that if China is able to, because they've operationalized the data and be able to scale it, and then that means that some of those places like the universities, whether it's in Cambridge, Boston, Massachusetts, the West Coast in Silicon Valley, Austin, Texas, or I should mention, because of agriculture, a lot of our agricultural-heavy states that have land-grant universities. What happens if suddenly, because we did not invest in that, then they no longer are the centers of gravity for research? It turns out that there's a shift to Beijing, to Suzhou, Shanghai, Shenzhen for academic excellence, not only for the U.S., but for other international countries, and those become the centers, and we lose that. That's something I don't think we're going to be able to recover from.
One area that is overlooked in the data realm is data to be used in the context of testing artificial intelligence capabilities. So we hear from defense contractors, startup companies. Sometimes it's hard to get government mission data for the capabilities that they're building, but that data is also essential for making sure that the capabilities that they're creating for the government are robust, are reliable, are representative of the missions that they're servicing. So having better channels for that data sharing to happen, whether it's to build or to evaluate capabilities, would benefit the entire community.
All right, Commissioner Price.
Thank you all very much. This is an excellent panel, and I appreciate all of your efforts. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to implement some of the policy suggestions that you all make, that we make to Congress. And what it keeps coming back to is, do Americans really want whatever change it is that we're looking for on any given day or at any specific hearing that we have? So I want to ask a hypothetical. In each of your areas that you were asked to address today, if you were talking to your neighbor, not someone who studies China or studies these issues or tech issues on a day-to-day basis, but why should they care? Why should it matter to them what kind of sensors they have on their car? They just know that it makes it easier to park. Why should they care about what information they're gathering through AI and what they're searching for and that kind of thing, and the same in the other areas as well. So you're having this short conversation with your neighbor. Give me your top lines of how you're going to explain to them why they should care and therefore why policymakers need to take action.
So again, coming from a biotech perspective, because we do not pay attention to the value of our personal data, and many times we don't have control of who it gets access to, or more importantly, who determines how valuable that is. The tagline I use is that we're going to wake up one day and realize, well, holy crap, we just become healthcare crack addicts and China's become our pusher. What happens if we completely dependent upon a foreign supply chain for our ability to maintain our fitness, our health? But then more importantly, that means that we've lost market share, we've lost job opportunities, and especially for the students, for example, that are studying biology in college right now, by the time they graduate, what prospects are we offering them if we're not understanding the value of the data, making the appropriate protections, but also more importantly, the investments to ensure that the U.S. stays the innovation lead globally in this space?
Yeah, so certainly from a privacy and a reliability perspective, many of the commercial AI tools are being used in every aspect of American life now, and people are revealing their private innermost thoughts to these technologies. And certainly, most Americans wouldn't want their most private thoughts exposed to their employers, to their insurance companies, to other countries. So that is one of the aspects that is important to manage that risk and make sure that individual privacy continues to be protected.
I would point my hypothetical neighbor towards a research report that was done by a group of Norwegian cybersecurity experts about 2 years ago. They bought a car in Norway, a Chinese-made car. They did a teardown of every sensor and tried to ascertain where the data from that sensor went. They found that the microphone inside of the car stored data, transmitted it to a server in China, and there was no visibility as to what was done with that data after the fact. And I don't think I'd have a hard time convincing my neighbor that they probably wanted some understanding of where the microphone in their car was transmitting to.
From an aerospace and defense side of things, the U.S. is the protector of democracy for the world. And I think that it's very hard for any neighbor I have, being foreign or American, to agree that we can't have any compromise of our defense capabilities going over to China. On the other side, from an aerospace standpoint, drones have already been filtered and people are very accustomed to seeing these around, and most of my neighbors want to shoot them out of the sky with their gun. So, this is also not hard to tell them, you might not want all of this information going over to China that they're collecting on you. And even though the data is not about them specifically, it's about this pattern of life and how things are used, it still creeps them out. So my neighbors are probably easy sell.
Great comments. Commissioner Kuiken.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Slevin. Mr. Yu, it's always good to see an original card-carrying member of the biotech mafia in front of the commission, so thank you for being here. You talked about adoption, or on the first panel we talked about convergence and adoption. And as we think about biotech data, or DNA data essentially, becoming more and more accessible and stored on the cloud, how should we think about the issue of convergence in AI in the biotech space? Because as Commissioner Shriver and I have been going around talking about last year's recommendation, this is an area where I think we're almost at the point where we're going to see this incredible flywheel start in the biotech space, not just in pharmaceuticals. I mean, everyone wants to talk about the cancer drugs or the thing that's going to make all of us live longer. The thing that actually gets me going is biomaterials, bioindustrials, bioagricultural space. How do we unlock biology as a general purpose technology? And I feel like as the Chinese continue to do this investment in data and in biotech, we're about to see an incredible acceleration. And we're the country in the democratic world unlocked chemistry and physics as a general purpose technology. Biotech is not unlocked yet. But this convergence, this accumulation of data seem to put us on that pathway. What do you think?
All too true. And I think that it's a sort of a recurring theme that we're one of the few developed countries that do not have a biotech strategy. And I think that just blows me away. So to your point, especially when, we cover down on health so much, but when you think about agriculture in particular, it's now no longer just farm to fork, it's farm to fiber, farm to fuel, especially on that aspect too. It's becoming strategic in its nature. And absolutely the convergence of AI and pattern of life behavior for plants, for example, or water usage. If you could, the entity that's able to optimize all that and translate that into efficient, crop yields, right? Then you are going to get renewables. You are going to get manufacturing materials, and as I said before, I can't forecast the future, but in light of what's happening right now with the global oil supply chain, for biofuels, for example, it really wasn't viable unless oil was, $120 per barrel. We were kind of there. But even if we go back down, I think the one thing that's changed is stability. I think that's in question now. So if that being the case, then suddenly renewables, to your point, that's biotech-based, is really going to become with renewed interest internationally, globally, and especially for China that is so much so energy dependent. So absolutely, yes, I full-heartedly agree that it's you're going to see major convergence and a lot of happening in biotech.
I was hoping you were going to tell me no. A couple of you have touched on this issue of exquisite versus good enough, and I think Dr. Staheli, you touched on this especially. The thing that I think we're starting to see is that one of the reasons the Chinese are being successful in the artificial intelligence space is they've basically adopted the good enough strategy. And so as I think back over the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and I think about the various secretaries of defenses and known unknowns, unknown unknowns, and all the iterations there, and then also the pursuit of the exquisite instead of the good enough. And the good enough is often what allows you to accelerate adoption. I think that's what you're telling us. Is there anything that we should think about in terms of policy recommendations that advance sort of a good enough approach? You know, it's okay to continue to pursue sort of the frontier lab exquisite approach, but is there a way we should think about the good enough as we think about deploying AI across the U.S. government, at state government level, at the local government level?
Yeah, so certainly when you're considering national level strategy, you should think of it in two sort of separate but related pieces. On the national security side, you want to worry about exquisite, best-of-breed frontier models because you want to be thinking about technological surprise and how to avoid that, also preserve that advantage for the United States. But on the economic side, cost is one of the driving factors of adoption. Innovation theory tells us that as innovations mature, the more that you can make your innovation available at a lower price point, the more your innovation is going to be adopted. From a perspective of China, certainly we should be looking at the countries that they're engaging with as far as what their abilities are to be able to adopt technology. Certainly countries, certainly in Africa, where low connectivity or mobile-first innovation ecosystems are going to be the predominant part of the economy. Smaller models, lightweight models, models that can run on your phone, models that can run on smaller infrastructure sets or data centers are going to be more prevalent there just because that's one of the limiting factors. And the more that we think about innovation in the government, we have to make sure that we're thinking about making a good match between the use case and what the technology need is when we're making choices about what technology we adopt. One of the gaps that we have right now is the ability to truly measure and characterize models for their abilities in different domains. So benchmarking is one way that's done, but it's very broad general testing. We don't have really yet a testing regime that helps us to identify, for my specific application, what are the metrics that I need to be hitting. We don't really have standard ways of testing or standard places that we go to test these models. And we know that there's lots of research happening in many different places. And that may be another opportunity for the collaboration that was talked about earlier as well. How do we get the expertise together to work on that problem?
Thank you.
Commissioner Hodges.
Thank you. So it seems clear based off of the testimony today that China's data acquisition strategy is not primarily aimed at penetrating U.S. systems. It's a big problem, but not one we're really focusing on today. But instead, it's a structural play at data dominance across modeling, operability, application, and that's global. I'm curious, as some of you were speaking, we were referencing sort of third-party countries, the idea of sort of nation sovereignty came up, and I'm curious if you've got any specific examples based off of your discussions where countries are starting to really prioritize the understanding and need for data sovereignty when it comes to AI or working on these different levels of components. Mr. Falco?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Sovereignty is a big deal right now across Europe. As I mentioned earlier, we're seeing this especially in the cloud services environment and in the data center infrastructure space. This is something where we are actively hearing about, and I work a lot with Nordic countries specifically, so Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Denmark. There's a major push to propel its very small innovation ecosystem. It's small just because numbers, right? They're smaller countries. But they're pushing their innovation ecosystem towards designing and building companies that are specifically trying to replicate what we're doing on our frontier models, on our data center infrastructure, on our energy system plays from a novel technology standpoint, because they just feel icky about working with the US in some ways right now, for better or worse. And this is something where we're seeing a directed investment in their innovation ecosystem for sovereignty. And I think that that's something that we don't necessarily have the mechanism to achieve necessarily in the US, and I don't think we want to replicate that, but it's happening very clearly in Europe, especially now we see Europe's defense strategy where they're doubling down on looking at Germany as a big protector of Europe. France and Italy are also part of that ecosystem, but they want German products, right? They want Dutch products. And I was at The Hague last week talking about novel UAVs for chemical weapon nonproliferation, and there was a whole bunch of products out there that we were talking about, and they had to be purchased from somewhere in Europe. And there was a whole bunch of capabilities that were Chinese and American, but those weren't on the top of the list. There was some prioritization mechanism there that said Europe first. So for better or worse, that's kind of where we're at right now with some of those allies.
Okay, thank you for that. And Mr. Yu, going back to you and sort of on the idea of bio, I'm curious, related to this question, some of the, there's been some interesting countries that have been sort of coming to Congress recently to talk about engagements on bio opportunities. I'm curious your perspective on this. Is there an opportunity for the U.S. to really lean into this and start working on bio front when it comes to emerging technology?
Absolutely there is. I think my fellow witness here mentioned it before, that we have a history of being innovators and leaders in the research and development space, and we should lean into that. And other aspects of it too is that, and this goes to sort of like the safeguarding science sort of perspective, is that, you know, as the U.S., we do want to highlight individual rights, individual privacy, right? So, and there's a reason why the U.S. has been leaders, because we do also believe in collaboration and openness and equity. That is why science has been able to accelerate as much and innovate so powerfully here in the U.S. We sort of lost sight of that, I think, a little bit. And so, but that's something that we should be leaning on, because that historically has been how we were able to have terrific scientific diplomacy, collaborations, partnerships. And sort of on the flip side too is that it's just basically, if we understand, again, the value of your data, the sensitivity, then it's basically do your due diligence, know who you're doing business with, read the fine print, understand what the risks are. And combining those two, I think we can still be very effective in partnerships internationally.
Thank you.
Anyone have follow-on questions? We have a little time. Go ahead.
Thank you, Commissioner Slevin. I was listening to you, Dr. Miller, and is it Mr. Falco or Dr. Falco? Doctor, sorry. Commissioner Shriver said no more first names. As I was listening to Chris talk about, you know, software and teardowns, I love a good teardown of a car or a chip. I was thinking about tire pressure monitoring systems in cars, because you know, those have been around for a long time, and all of the things that you said sound really scary, but these TPMS systems have been around for a long time, and there's sensors all around every city that pick these up, and you can basically geolocate anything. So I had a friend recently tell me he went to visit one of the intelligence agencies, and he didn't bring his phone, and I said, "Did you drive your car?" And he looked at me and said, "Well, of course I did." And I was like, "Okay, then somebody can track down where you are." So it was one of these things that sort of amused me. It also got to me thinking, Chris or Dr. Miller and Dr. Falco, on your comments, where we have this download now, decrypt later sort of philosophy going on. I guess I'd be interested in your view on that whole space and how we should think about that in the context of data, whether it's car data or biotech data like Mr. Yu talked about. And then the second thing that I had this moment as I was reacting in my head to you guys is, why not just give up? Why does this even matter? So, you know, Commissioner Price talked about, you know, her neighbor. I have this moment all the time where it's like, I mean, Google already has all of my data. Amazon has all of my data. I don't have a Facebook account, but I'm sure they've hoovered up something somewhere. And so why not just give up? Does this matter? Like, boil it down to me in sort of a very crisp and clean way. And if either, you know, Mr. Yu, if you have something on the biotech comment, go ahead. So that's my question. Why not give up? download now, decrypt later. You can talk about tire pressure monitoring systems too if you'd like.
Well, thank you for the question. I think it is an important one. You're right to say that there are lots of different devices that have our location, that listen to what we're saying in certain ways. I think the keys to me are twofold. First, do we understand what standards are in place? Google has all of my data, but I've learned over the last 20 years that I have some ability to trust what they do with my data. They don't leak it very often. They have a track record of pretty good cybersecurity, probably not perfect, but I think I understand roughly what they're going to do with my data in a way that I don't understand many other devices that I have. And so that to me is a key question. And I think we should assume a different level of vulnerability for a device or a software system built in the United States versus in an allied country versus in China. And I know the Commission has done work on the legal requirements that Chinese firms have to hand over data. Even if the firm itself doesn't want to, the party can demand it. So I would differentiate between levels of risk for different types of data that's being gathered based on who is actually gathering the data. The second thing I would say is that there are different volumes of data gathered by different types of systems. It's true that tire pressure monitors can, in many cases, identify where you are. But I guess I would posit to you that my GPS location is a lot less valuable than my GPS location plus a microphone plus a camera inside the car plus 10 cameras outside the car, et cetera, that are fusing that data together and providing a much richer picture of what I'm doing, where I'm driving, and everyone else who's driving around me, everyone else who's walking the streets around me, coupled with facial recognition in terms of what the cameras are seeing on the sidewalks around me. And so I think we should impose higher standards for devices that are gathering more types and broader categories of data than, for example, just a single tire pressure monitor system. And so that would be the rubric. A, do we understand who is setting the requirements around the data? Is it a U.S. company? Is it a foreign company? And then B, what are the quantities and types of data that are actually being gathered? And that would be the rubric I'd use to determine what's my willingness to pay to substitute in U.S. components or design out Chinese software in any given type of system.
If I may, I really like that recommendation about one type of data, not so interesting. Multiple types of data, maybe you have to worry about that a little bit more. But to the why do we care, I've long thought that privacy is dead, and I still believe that, even though I've been working on trying to make it not that case for a while. We need to care because of the ability to anticipate with this data. We don't want everyone to know what we're going to do next. Mind reading is not an actual thing right now, but it will be an actual thing if you have enough data to be able to anticipate movements and be able to cross-correlate across all these things. So our privacy on an individual level might be gone, but right now we still have the ability to protect anticipation and operational surprise. And I think that's starting to go away if we allow too much data collection.
I know, Mr. You want to do this. I just want to respond. You've just given us the title for this chapter, Privacy is Dead. Thank you very much for that. The one thing I would say is, though, that the amount of data that's available that I can just buy, like, Dr. Miller, you pushed back on me a little bit on the tire pressure monitoring system. I mean, I agree with you. At the same time, I can go acquire all these things. I mean, Salt Typhoon and Vault Typhoon are operational preparation of the environment. And that is data collection, and that's, that gets to your microphone issue and all those things. So anyway, I thank you for the title to the chapter, and Mr. Yu.
So just a couple of things. First off, at the end of the day, we still have our data. It's our data. So it's what are the investments we're making to capitalize and operationalize the data for ourselves, to be able to continue to be the first mover advantage leaders in innovation. So there's that. The second part kind of goes back to Commissioner Price's question. Why should we care? How do we articulate this? On the bio-threat angle, I have had a lot of debates, because especially when I get rubbed the wrong way when they say, well, when it comes to bio-threats, you have to factor in global catastrophic risk, and like, well, are we talking about 100 million plus fatalities? And I'm like, come on now. Is that important? Sure. But in my mind, I want to commend the Commission for tackling this. This is absolutely a challenging issue. If we don't address this now, then my nightmare scenario is that what happens if we suddenly find out that because of the access to the data, we find that an authoritarian regime has control or influence in all aspects of our ability to live? You know, the ability to maintain our health, control of our food supply, looking at the future of renewables, all because we failed to recognize where our data is going, how it's going to be utilized. And I agreed, I don't think privacy as we knew it exists, but data privacy might just be a simple question of who gets to see my data? At least we should be able to determine that. Second question I want is about data sovereignty, meaning more about who determines what my data means and ascribes the value to it, because I don't have any control over that. And then finally, data security is basically going to be who gets to access the data and what are they going to do with that. I think those are going to be some three critical questions that we should be able to answer as we move forward, because AI is not going to stop. But so my colleague's right, I don't think privacy exists anymore, at least in the framework that we used to recognize it, but there are some of these other fundamental questions that we should be tackling, because the nightmare scenario is not acceptable as an individual and especially as a democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Yu. Thank you for the questions. Great hearing, guys.
I'll exercise privilege on a comment, and I want to go to Commissioner Hodges, but also on this question of why should we care? Maybe it's being in the presence of Dr. Miller, who wrote the book on chips, and colleagues like Mike Hyken, who worked so much on the legislation. But there was a small community of national security professionals, maybe a small percentage of readers of the Wall Street Journal, who kind of understood the dependency we had on Taiwan and elsewhere for semiconductors. I think, to me, what made it applicable to your neighbor was when, in 2020, auto companies were furloughing workers, and it became more visceral. I don't know what the right analog to that, to the discussion we're having, but being with Dr. Miller and appreciating his book, wanted to make that comment. Commissioner Hodges.
All right, thank you. I'll keep it short, but Dr. Falco, your exchange with Commissioner Hyken on privacy led me to kind of want to ask this question. You said, mind reading is not possible yet and all that, and completely agree. From your perspective, though, is there a real threat, and I'd open this up to the rest of the panel as well, is there a real threat related to sort of data's implications on potential nefarious actors' abilities to have sort of some type of cognitive engagement or cognitive manipulation?
That's a great question. If they're able to anticipate our future actions as a result of the dragnet of information that's being collected from a tactical standpoint, from a, let's say we're talking about drones or building a space vehicle that may engage on orbit in dogfighting ways, I believe that there probably are ways that they can incept scenarios in public dialogue that would make us go different directions with our technology development. And I think that that is actually a real threat. They're going to be using the media in order to facilitate this. We already see this. I do work with NATO, and when we come up with a new idea, it's published in the news, and then 2 weeks later we hear something out from the South China Morning Post of how China's combated that already, and this is the new direction they're going in. So that cat and mouse game already exists from the mind game standpoint. The question is, where do we get dragged down with them?
Thanks.
Could I just note on that front? I mean, it seems to me we've got in the social media sphere plenty of evidence of companies already being able to predict what people would like to click on. This was the key driver behind Congress's completely justified concern about TikTok. And the ability of ByteDance to understand what video one wants to see next is an example in a narrow space, but an example of this capability already being widely demonstrated.
Yeah, appreciate that.
I think that concludes our hearing. Really excellent discussion. I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony. As a reminder, all of the written testimonies and the transcript of this hearing will be posted on our website, uscc.gov. With that, we are adjourned.